Good morning, everybody. This is an extraordinary meeting of the Fire Resilience and Emergency Planning Committee. Under Section 1.7 of the Authority's Standing Orders, I confirm that this meeting be called as a matter of urgency in order to consider the Phase 1 report from the Grenfell Tower Inquiry at the earliest opportunity, in accordance with Section 100B(4)(b) of the Local Government Act 1972. Sorry, could I have any apologies for absence?
Yes, Chair. Apologies have been received from Assemblymember Bacon, for whom Assemblymember Bailey is substituting, Assemblymember Eshleimi, for whom Assemblymember Duval is substituting, and Assemblymember Curtin.
Thank you. The main item today is, as I've said, a discussion on the Phase 1 report of the Grenfell Tower Inquiry. Could I ask everyone to check their electronic devices to switch to silent mode to avoid any interruptions? Members of the public may like to follow at London Assembly on Twitter and use the hashtag #AssemblyFire for this meeting. Can I ask members to note the list of officers on the report and ask if they have any additional interest to declare? Thank you. We now come to the main item of today's business, the discussion on the Grenfell Tower Inquiry, and I'd like to invite those present to stand for a minute's silence in memory of those who lost their lives. Thank you. Firstly, can I welcome our guests, Dr. Fiona Twycross, Deputy Mayor, Fire and Resilience, London Fire Commissioner Dany Cotton, Assistant Commissioner Andy Bell, Roy Wilsher, Chair of the National Fire Chiefs Council, Mark Hardingham, Chair of the National Fire Chiefs Council Protection and Business Safety Committee, and Chief Fire Officer and Executive Director at Suffolk County Council, and Matt Rack, General Secretary of the Fire Brigade Union. Thank you for all for coming. I will ask you if you want, any of you want to make an opening statement shortly, but I think it's important to note first of all that the report is a sobering, harrowing and heart-wringing account of the disaster as it unfolded minute by minute. And reading the full report, as I've done, provides a clear understanding of why the bereaved survivors and residents feel the frustration and anger that so many of them do. It's clear that firefighters displayed extraordinary courage on the night of the fire, as acknowledged in the report and as we rightly recognise today. The Fire Brigade was not responsible for the cause of the fire or its rapid spread, which was due to the woeful management of the building, the alterations, and as the report says, the ACM flammable cladding, which compromised the building's ability to resist fire and protect the residents. Nevertheless, the report, along with its recommendations, sets out matters of particular concern relating to London Fire Brigade, and we will be exploring some of those concerns in this meeting, including what happened in control, learning the lessons of the Lacanal House fire, the lack of active communication between control and the incident ground, the failure to understand and disseminate the risks of cladding fires in high-rise buildings, and to understand the obligations under Section 7(2)(d). The report raises far-reaching questions for Part 2 of the inquiry as to whether the London Fire Brigade training is adequate and whether it's capable of learning from its mistakes. So we have quite a lot of ground to cover today, but I would like to start by asking those present if they would like to make a brief opening statement. I'll start with the Deputy Mayor, then Dany.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for the opportunity to make a statement at the start of what is obviously a significant, extraordinary meeting. For me, the part of the report that reminds us most powerfully why it was written, why we're here today, is a section with pen portraits towards the back, which describes the individuals who died. The 72 victims of Grenfell Tower fire, those bereaved and those who lost everything they owned, have to be at the heart of our response to this report. The Mayor, myself, and as she's made clear, the Commissioner accept the recommendations fully and unequivocally. We will work with the Brigade, the trade unions and other stakeholders to make sure that those that apply to the London Fire Brigade are implemented and embedded as quickly as is possible. The report also rightly recognises, as you stated, the individual bravery of firefighters and control staff. I've spoken to many of those involved about what they did that night, about what they couldn't do, and what they experienced will undoubtedly never leave them. Sir Martin Morbick makes it clear that the building should never have been clad in the way it was. This remains a fire that should never have happened. The institutional failures within the Brigade outlined in the report require a hugely challenging level of systemic change that goes probably beyond the Brigade itself to the sector. The Mayor has personally committed to doing everything within his power to ensure that this change happens and that all the inquiry recommendations are implemented. We will work with the Commissioner and her team to address those aimed at the LFB. To that end, the Mayor will publish publicly regular updates on progress against each of the recommendations, including those aimed at the LFB and those aimed at building owners and managers. We will consult both with the Grenfell community and this Assembly Committee as to what should be included in this reporting, how we present it, its frequency, and of course we will continue to be available to you for your scrutiny on progress. I would conclude by saying that we welcome the opportunity for what I know will be a frank discussion today and the ongoing scrutiny I know this committee will provide. If we're serious about making sure nothing like Grenfell Tower Fire happens again, we need to be honest and open about what we collectively need to do in order to address this. Thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner.
Thank you. I'd like to begin by taking this opportunity again on behalf of everyone at London Fire Brigade to express our deepest sorrow at not being able to save all of those who died in the Grenfell Tower fire. We will never forget the suffering of the bereaved, survivors and of the community. As I set out to you 3 weeks ago, London Fire Brigade has made considerable changes and we've been working since the fire to do all we can to prevent such a tragedy from happening again. The publication of Sir Martin Morbick's Phase 1 findings focused hard on our response, and I want to thank every firefighter officer and control officer who gave evidence in person in Phase 1. We accept all of Sir Martin Morbick's recommendations, which obviously include safety information for residents in high-rise buildings and improved markings on floor levels and staircases. I also fully accept the areas of learning that the Chairman has set out specifically for London Fire Brigade to act on. As I said, many of those are in train, including the improvement of our training for incident commanders and for managing large numbers of fire survival calls handled by our 999 control officers. With the Phase 1 report comprising nearly 1,000 pages, we are now working to ensure we fully understand all of the findings, and we will be setting out how we can respond to each of the recommendations. Many of those are more complex than they first appear, which demonstrates how complex fire safety is, and each recommendation must not only be considered by London Fire Brigade, but by government, every fire and rescue service, and every residential building owner and manager across the UK. Understandably, the findings in relation to the National Stay Put strategy are of significant interest, and I want to be as clear as I can be about my response at this stage of the public inquiry. During media interviews last week, I explained that knowing what we have learned since about how the fire spread and about the building safety failures, we would have responded differently. Let me be clear also that Stay Put strategy does need urgent focus. I sat here recently explaining why I'm backing the call for urgent research into what happens when a building fails and fire spreads unusually, meaning Stay Put cannot be relied upon. And I do so even with the knowledge and assurance that of the 5,000 high-rise fires we've attended in the last 6 years, the National Stay Put strategy has been effective in getting to fires and putting them out and not injuring residents. The Chairman also recognised that mass evacuation of occupants would no doubt have presented serious risks to the lives of residents and firefighters, given the layout of the building and the absence of any communication systems. So we must hear all of the evidence to properly understand the really significant challenges of evacuating Grenfell Tower, given the building was never designed for such an evacuation. And we know that further understanding and evidence will be gathered during Phase 2. And that is why at this stage my focus is on making sure that we are prepared to respond as well as we can to buildings known to have a fire risk, pushing for a review of what to do when buildings fail, and responding to fires where building safety measures do work as they should to keep residents safe. We will now look to address each of the recommendations made, and we will continue to assist the Grenfell Tower Inquiry throughout Phase 2, which is expected to begin in February next year.
Thank you. Mr Wilsher, do you want to make any statement?
Thank you, Chair. I've not got a statement, just to say that my thoughts and the thoughts of the National Fire Chiefs Council with those victims, bereaved, survivors, the residents, and just to say thank you for the invitation to this extremely important committee.
You want to make a statement?
If I can, Chair, thank you very much. I would echo the comments that have been made in regard to our thoughts being with those who lost their lives, the bereaved, the survivors and the community of Grenfell. I would echo the comments that Commissioner Cotton has made in regards to the actions of firefighters that night, most of whom were our members. It's a phrase that we don't often use, but I think we did see real heroism by firefighters throughout that incident in impossible situations. In terms of the report, we broadly welcome the recommendations. I think one comment we would make that we've made throughout this debate following the fire is that many of the recommendations directed at the London Fire Brigade we believe are national matters and should be addressed nationally. We have throughout the inquiry and from the start of the inquiry expressed our concern about the ordering of the matters for inquiry, in that the scrutiny has been entirely on the response of the London Fire Brigade and of firefighters without in detail considering how the building came to be in the condition in which it was, and the actions, the behaviour of the fire and therefore the response of firefighters cannot be fully considered without that full consideration of how the building came to be in that condition. We welcome the references to the need for systemic change. It's a point we have made for many years in relation to fire policy across the UK. I have to say that we heard from the start, in the immediate aftermath of the fire, both from government ministers, from chief fire officers, that this would be a turning point. I have to say, from the perspective of firefighters, so far we have seen very little change in reality. So we really hope that this will be a turning point. We do have some concerns with the narrative in the report, particularly in terms of the debate regarding evacuation. And we have some concerns about how those conclusions were reached by the inquiry, and I think that does need examining further when the evidence certainly of firefighters on the ground would be that an evacuation was extremely difficult, if not impossible. And that's certainly something that the fire service as a whole needs to be addressing. In relation to the question of stay put and evacuation, we have some concerns that we have raised this matter for many years. The Fire Brigade Union first raised the issue of stay put and concerns around stay put in 2005 following a fire in Hertfordshire. We have raised it subsequently. And in relation to Grenfell Tower, we raised it directly with government ministers in the months after the fire, and we raised it with the Grenfell Tower Inquiry in relation to the possibility of urgent recommendations last December. We note that nobody has taken any action in terms of that, but there is obviously a very strong recommendation about the need for guidance in relation to stay put. Our concern is that those actions could have been taken much more quickly. In terms of the engagement with the community, the Fire Brigade Union has placed a great deal of effort in seeking to have a dialogue with a community in the most difficult of circumstances, because we don't see the interests of firefighters being any different to the interests of the residents of that community. We all seek to achieve fundamental change in terms of fire policy and planning within the fire and rescue service. The issues that are raised arising from the report in relation to lesson learning, and I think I would use the phrase lesson applying, are ones that we think need a thorough discussion. Our concern over many years is that lessons of incidents, fatalities and the like are not fully applied within the Fire and Rescue Service. Many such debates arise following the deaths of our own members, and our attendance at inquests. Our reviewing of those processes find that in many cases coroners make recommendations which have been made previously, which suggests that the Fire and Rescue Service as a whole is not applying the lessons previously learned. So there are some major failings within the fire service nationally on that front. And my final point would be in relation to fire policy more generally, that for something like 16, 17 years, we have heard a mantra from central government and from politicians that fire is a declining risk in society, and the logic of that is that you can survive with less resources, fewer fire stations, less of a need for fire safety inspections, and if the story ever since that time has been a decline in resources for the Fire and Rescue Service, including significantly in this regard a very significant decline in the fire safety departments, both in the London Fire Brigade and across the country. There is indeed and has been a deep complacency in policy setting about fire and rescue. This must be a turning point. It should have been a turning point 28 months ago. It hasn't so far, in my view, but now we must take that opportunity.
Thank you. Assistant Commissioner Bell and Chief Hardingham, I assume that you don't want to add anything to what Commissioner Cotton and Mr Wilsher said. Yeah. In that case, can we go into the detailed questioning from us? And I think what you've said is your initial reactions to the findings. So could I ask Commissioner Cotton, is the London Fire Brigade as an institution able to learn and apply the lessons from those mistakes, bearing in mind what Matt has said? And knowing what we now know from the inquiry, would you change anything the London Fire Brigade did on the night of the fire?
So first I'd like to say yes, London Fire Brigade is clearly ready to learn. The fact that we instigated our own internal investigation team the week of the Grenfell Tower fire because we wanted to learn lessons and we wanted to be able to identify those areas before even the inquiry was to publish its report, shows that we were very willing to identify our own mistakes and put systems in place to learn from those. Clearly, knowing what we know now about Grenfell Tower and similar buildings with ACM cladding, our response would be very different. And obviously we know that there are still several hundred buildings in London that are covered in ACM cladding that have waking watches in them. Our concern is that action is not being taken quickly enough to remove that cladding, which is a high risk. But obviously, knowing what we know now, the actions that we would take and the training we've put in place for our officers would mean we would respond in a different way.
In what way would that be?
Sorry?
In what way would that response be different?
So the response, so now not only have we increased our attendance, so if we receive a call to a high-rise fire, we've increased the number of fire engines we send. If there's several calls to the same building and if the callers state the outside the building's on fire, we send an initial attendance of 10 fire engines, plus officers, plus specialist appliances to ensure that we have large numbers of staff there at a very early stage. We've also given training to our officers on different ways to attempt to contact members of the public in buildings that obviously have no clear means for communicating with them, be that by the use of our new drone technology that has allowed hailer, or by attempting to use other methods to actually be able to alert residents in the event of a fire, and to ensuring that where we know there are waking watches in place, that our watches visit those high-rise buildings, are familiar with the premises, and ensure that we're working with building owners to understand how we would assist with an evacuation from those buildings.
Thank you. Well, you've already indicated, as Fiona, that you accept all the recommendations of the report, and I assume that everybody else does as well. In which case, could I ask all of you, do you think the recommendations go far enough, and is there anything more you'd like to see at this stage? Perhaps we could start with Dany and then work round.
So I was very disappointed that the recommendations did not include anything about sprinklers. Because we are aware, we've been campaigning for years about the effectiveness of sprinklers as a means of not only fire suppression but of alerting people to the event of a fire. So, from the previous evidence we've seen, we're very disappointed that it didn't include that. But I think that we are very pleased to see the breadth of the recommendations, not only for the fire service nationally, but for government and for building owners and providers, because there are a number of steps that all of us need to take to ensure this never happens again and that we can protect people in high-rise buildings.
Yeah, Mr Wilsher, anything you'd like to add?
I absolutely agree with Councillor Cotton. The recommendations are far-ranging. I think they are something we can... They are lessons identified, as Matt Rack said. We now need to turn them into lessons learned and make sure we learn those lessons for the public. Absolutely agree on sprinklers or automatic water suppression systems. There should be more about that. I think the other recommendation I'd like to have seen is some sort of resource implication, support from government to help fire and rescue services nationally look at these recommendations and turn them into better policy for all of us.
I'm going to come back to the resources issue in a minute. Matt?
2 points. I think the first one for us would be that we think that many of the recommendations directed at the London Fire Brigade are in reality national, or should be national matters. They affect, we have these buildings all over the country, certainly across England and Wales, possibly less so in Scotland, but they are national matters, and therefore the recommendations need to be addressed by the Fire and Rescue Service across the UK. And I would echo Roy Wilsher's comments about resources. Our initial assessment of these are that many of them will have resource implications. They cannot be done on the cheap. They cannot simply add additional workload to primarily our assessment junior officers on fire stations with another round of paperwork to deal with on top of all the other targets they're already dealing with.
So going on to resources, I mean, one thing that struck me was the substantial amount of data management that the report's calling for in relation to information about buildings, construction, alterations, fire safety planning and so forth. And then for you to put that into the ORD and so forth. Commissioner Cotton, what do you think the resource implications are for London?
Obviously, you'll be aware the building stock in London is vast, and for us, the storage of that information, but more importantly, ensuring that information is up to date, is checked, and that we have the right information at the right time will be key. And not only will it be, when they talk about they're talking about paper and electronic copies of this information, so the storage and refresh and accuracy of that is something that we will have to look into a system for doing. But equally to make sure, most importantly, that it is available to our frontline firefighters when they attend those buildings. So whether it be the paper copies in the storage boxes at the high-rise buildings, or whether it be the ones available on the electronic tablets. And it is for us about making sure that not only us as the Fire and Rescue Service have the information, but the building owners are supplying us and keeping changes regularly updated. And that's some of our areas of concern, especially when you're talking about personal evacuation plans. Clearly we need to be made aware of who is in those buildings, but that actually the importance is that that is information that needs to be regularly updated. And when people change in those premises, we need to be made aware of that.
What other resource implications do you think there are for London?
So I think that the difficulty for London Fire Brigade is about size and scale of the amount of buildings, and when we look at the recommendations made about some of the areas of inspection, absolutely we welcome the fact that London Fire Brigade needs to make sure that all of our officers and firefighters are involved in knowing fully the buildings, but it is the scale of those in London that causes concern, because we don't want to find ourselves in these situations again. And the conversation I had with you previously about not knowing about some of the at-risk buildings in London until we attend them is our concern. The fact that building regulations have not been complied with for so long, and the fact that we still think there are probably buildings being designed and built today that would not perform as we would expect in a fire, that's a serious area of concern for us.
Okay, Mr Hardingham, I'll come back to Matt.
Thank you. I think a couple of points really. Clearly the focus in the built environment is around high-rise residential buildings over 18 metres, but there are many other building types across London and across the UK which present similar hazards, and I think when we talk about providing data and information to frontline firefighters and incident commanders to enable them to deal with incidents in that built environment, then we're talking about a very broad range of buildings in addition to the stock of high-rise residential buildings. I think some of the other resource challenges is about it's providing the information to firefighters and incident commanders is one part of it. The necessary training and development for those firefighters to enable them to take good quality decisions with that information in the sort of dynamic environment they'll find when they're dealing with fires. There are resource challenges for fire services across the country. around protection staff in particular, looking at regulating the built environment. I don't think there are many fire services in the country who are not struggling around the recruitment and retention of those very highly qualified technical staff, given the challenges of resourcing that and losing people into the private sector and elsewhere. And I think the final resource challenge will be around one for the National Fire Chiefs Council. Clearly, if we are going to be at the heart with government and colleagues across the fire sector to deliver the sort of national change that we need to deliver on the back of this, we need to be properly resourced to enable us to do that.
Thank you. Matt, you want to take?
Yeah, I'm just picking up one of the comments that Commissioner Cotton has made, and it strikes me that fire and rescue services should have been aware of the risks in their communities. That's what integrated risk management planning is supposed to be about. What we are now seeming to be aware of is that actually fire and rescue services may not have been aware of the risks across their communities. That is alarming. And certainly, and I don't refer to Commissioner Cotton here, but certainly her predecessors have come to politicians here and in previous authorities and made the case that actually we can go through significant reductions. So the fire safety teams in the London Fire Brigade have been cut by something like 25%. And I wonder, how do we expect fire and rescue services to be aware of the risks in local communities if we go about cutting 25% of the teams supposedly responsible for being making us aware of those risks? So, and I have to say that's a story across the country. Fire chiefs have come for the past 10 years in particular and made the case that actually we can safely reduce the fire and rescue service. And I think this needs to be a wake-up call to my colleagues in the National Fire Chiefs Council that needs to stop. In terms of resource implications on a national scale, I come back to the question of stay put and evacuation. To my knowledge, there has never been an evacuation on the scale debated in relation to Grenfell Tower in the UK. Nobody knows how it would be done or the resources that it would require. We've written to government ministers on this matter over many months. It strikes us that there needs to be a major national project to address that. Firstly, because it needs to be scoped out, it needs to have professional input, and it needs to have fire and rescue service input. That's a major piece of work. Secondly, if we are talking about the mass evacuation of buildings in such circumstances, there are significant resource implications for the fire and rescue service across the country. The London Fire Brigade is one of the best resourced fire and rescue services in the country. I dread to think what would have happened if this had happened elsewhere. And finally, on the point about the NFCC, I have to say to my colleagues in the NFCC, I think the NFCC have been part of the problem in terms of the fragmentation of the fire and rescue service. And I hope we approach this in a more joined up way to how we're going to solve the challenges set by the Grenfell Tower inquiry.
Well, thank you. And Fiona, issue of resources ultimately comes back to you and to the Mayor. We know that immediately after the fire, the Mayor made available £6 million for running costs and £6 million for new kit, which the government refused to help with. Will the Mayor be able to find the resources, clearly substantial resources, as we've just heard, needed to enable all these recommendations to be implemented?
We've obviously only just started digesting the sort of true likely costs of some of the potential changes that people have identified, and I think we'll be discussing that over the next few weeks, and we'll come back to Budget and Performance Committee in December now to talk to colleagues about that. This is a national issue though, so I do think that we would be looking to a national solution, not just in terms of the changes that need to be made, but also in terms of the resourcing implications that some of the other panel members have said. What I would say is that this isn't just about changing policies or changing the kit people have. Reading the report, as I know you have done, actually when they talk about systemic change, when the judge talks about systemic change or institutional issues, that's actually a massive culture change piece as well. So I think if we only talk about the changes to the policies without actually talking about what is meant by systemic change, what is meant by institutional problems, will actually risk not actually addressing the problems that are identified or the problems that arose for the long term. So, and that's actually much more complicated than just changing policies or changing procedures or buying the new equipment that we do need to do. And I think the Economist summed it up quite nicely, because they said that the culture change that was required was on the level that was required after the Piper Alpha disaster. So I think that's the scale of the issue. It's not going to be achieved overnight. We will be as transparent as I've outlined already, but actually this is a massive task that goes beyond simply changing policies or changing procedures or buying the necessary new equipment. This is about culture change on a absolutely massive scale, and I've already been discussing with the Commissioner how we'll go about this, but this is actually a task that isn't just an issue, as people have mentioned, for the Brigade. This is a sector-wide issue. Okay,
and before I bring Assemblymember Hall in, I want to ask some questions on resources. Looking at the other key challenges in the report, which may not be to do with resources, what other problems do you think there may be in implementing some of the recommendations? For example, on training, I know we have the contract with Babcock, which is somewhat inflexible. Will that be able to be amended, and obviously with resource implications, to deal with all the additional training requirements set out in the recommendations and report?
I think there's already been discussion on that. I might hand over to Dany or Andy to answer that one.
Andy.
We do have the ability to flex the contract, and we have done recently. So we've in terms of the instant command training that we've put in for level 1 and level 2 commanders, we were able to flex the contract and reprioritise some of the courses, which put a number of training units available, and therefore we were able to seek training from outside of the Babcock contract through the Fire Service College. So I think that flexibility is there. It just requires a commitment, which I think we've shown we're already making, to be willing to flex that contract, and Babcock have to show that flexibility as well, and to date they are showing that.
What about training for control, which is a major issue coming out of the report, and for senior officers as well?
Well, as you know, control training is not currently included within the Babcock contract, and we are having conversations. The independent review of training the Commissioner implemented and has now reported suggests that it would be preferential for the control training to be included in the contract, and we're having those conversations now. In terms of senior officers, their training is included in the Babcock contract, and the work and we've done around maintenance of competence, as you'll be aware, DAMOP Phase 1 has gone in for frontline staff, and Phase 2 of that project will roll out in the middle of next year. And that will include a new maintenance of competency framework for both senior officers and control staff going forward. So I think we are making changes. There's a long way to go, but we're on the right steps, I think.
Thank you. And Roy, do you envisage any other key challenges apart from resources in implementing the recommendations?
Well, I think I'd like to back up what everyone else is saying. These are national issues as well. Wherever you see the London Fire Brigade it is a national implication as well. That's why we stand with and alongside London Fire Brigade to move this forward. I think there are, if you look outside of London to the way fire services are organised and resourced, so control rooms, you might have control rooms with 4 or 5 people on duty at night, having a policy and training that deals with mass fire survival guidance. How we support people to do that is important. We have retained or part-time firefighters in many parts of the country with 2 or 3 hours training most weeks. How we bring this cultural change, systemic change into those organisations is just as important for us as a National Fire Chiefs Council.
Okay, Matt.
Yeah, if I can, I'd echo the comment that Fiona made about the need for a fundamental change in culture, because I think the culture that has crept in over approaching 2 decades now is a complacent one. It says that because and it's common across the advanced economies, because there is a declining number of fire incidents, therefore the risk of fire has declined, therefore we can reduce our awareness of preparedness for fire incidents. Actually, if you used to have 100 fires in the community, you now have 80. The people who have the 80 fires still deserve the same standard of fire response, in our view, as when they had 100. But that's not the logic that has been approached, that has been adopted for the past 20 years or so. And I think, you know, in terms of training, I think there needs to be a fundamental rethink about that. Again, that is reflected in doing everything on the cheap. Let's sell off the Fire Service College, let's outsource training in the London Fire Brigade and elsewhere, and to then appeal to Babcocks to be flexible. Babcocks are a commercial organisation. Babcocks will do what Babcocks need to do for their own commercial interests. And I think there should be a much more fundamental approach. Actually, we don't want privatised training in the Fire and Rescue Service. And that's the position of the Fire Brigade Union. Picking up some of the points that Roy Wilsher made, in terms of training, again, on a national issue, we have fire services who for years have gradually cut back on initial, I don't think this is necessarily the case in the London Fire Brigade, but elsewhere, fire services who have cut back on initial training to firefighters. That means that actually they aren't being trained in things that were once part and parcel of basic initial training, building construction, or how we deal with that in a modern built environment and so on. Roy mentions controls. He mentions having 4 and 5 on duty. We have fire service controls in some parts of the country which go down to a crewing level of 1. And how the hell they can deal with anything like this is unquestionable. But I have to say to Roy, in each case, and this is the problem we have when we approach government ministers on this, government ministers respond by saying, there has been an IRMP, it has been recommended by the professional advisor to the Fire Authority, which is the Chief Fire Officer, and it has been approved by the Fire and Rescue Authority. So the government can wash its hands of the fact that we have 1 on duty, and until the profession starts to stand up and say, you cannot have an emergency fire control with 1 person on duty, and I say this to my colleagues in the National Fire Chiefs Council, until you start saying that it's not acceptable, until you start saying, Mark, that you can't send fire crews out with 3 riders on a pump, then these things are going to continue. I have to say, I'm concerned that the complacency is still there.
Thanks. Susan.
Yes, thank you. Because of comments made, I think, primarily by the Fire Brigade Union, and I do understand you are there to protect your members and to make sure you've got as many members as possible, etc. And I understand that. When Mayor Khan came into position, he organised a review, the Mayor Review. And the Mayor Review said that, OK, don't reduce any more, but the amount of firefighters, etc., that we have at the moment is absolutely adequate. So it was looked at that point. Fires decreasing by, I think it was 50% in 10 years, is purely because of the work that the firefighters done and various regulations that have been in. So well done to them. But it had reduced fires to a drastic level, which is why reductions were deemed as necessary. I've heard, I'm pretty sure, perhaps the Commissioner can vouch for this, the Commissioner did say that at Grenfell there were enough firefighters on the ground and that this was not an issue. Can you confirm you've said that?
So the number of firefighters, when we increased our resources to 40 fire engines, we physically could not have put any more firefighters into the building at one time. As you know, obviously the single staircase issue meant that we didn't have that. I mean, the longer term issues of our fire safety officers is something we've discussed before, and a shortage of those, but our frontline firefighters on the night were there in number in a very short space of time.
Yes, and I've heard you say that on numerous occasions. And I put that back to you, Mr. Rack. One of the things that I'm particularly concerned about, that when I did my extensive visits on fire stations, and I was with all the borough commanders of the whole of London, I was told in numerous boroughs that when the firefighters were not working, which is accepted that it's a vast amount of the time, because they've done so well and reduced fires so drastically, one of the things, other than do fire safety checks, which we're forever grateful, the other thing that they did and they had to do was familiarise themselves with all the buildings on their patch. Clearly this wasn't done in this case. Is that correct?
So it's correct to say the information that they stored on the electronic system when they did their what we call 72D visit was not by any means suitable or sufficient for Grenfell Tower. The firefighters and the officers from North Kensington were very familiar with the building because it was a place that they visited regularly, not only to carry out home fire safety inspections but for smaller operational incidents. But the information they had stored and recorded about it was in no way suitable or contained any level of detail that was of any use.
Okay, so that wasn't a resourcing fact, it was a training issue.
That was it. It was about the level of information that they put on there and stored on there. Yeah, so that was, and that's why we've done such a fundamental review of how we store our operational risk information.
Yes, we'll come to that. Okay, I'll leave it at that for the time. Thank you.
So, Matt, do you want to...
I can, yeah. I suppose that my difference with Susan Hall's view on this is the following: that a fire, whether there is one fire or 10 fires in a community, the fire remains the same, and the risk to the people in that one fire or those 10 fires remains the same. And our view is that the service which should be provided to the community, whether they're having one fire or they're having 10 fires, should be the same. What we've actually seen is that because of the reduction in fire, which is for a range of factors, the fire service work is certainly one of them, but there are societal factors as well at work. But what we've seen from politicians during the past 15 years is the argument that because the number of fires has declined, the service provided to communities when the fire happens can also be reduced. So response times across the UK are 20% slower than they were 20 years ago. I don't think that's progress. And the proof of the pudding happens when we have Grenfell, because actually I don't necessarily disagree with what Commissioner Cotton has said about the resources on the night from the London Fire Brigade. I suppose I make a point nationally that had that happened elsewhere, the disaster would have been far worse. But in terms of resources, what we... Dany Cotton has said today that actually things would now be dealt with differently, and people are talking about evacuation. As I say, nobody has actually conducted an evacuation on that scale in any residential building in the UK.
I accept that.
So there are huge resource
We're talking about resources here. We're coming on to different subjects in a minute. We're talking about resources.
If I can finish my point on resources. If I can finish my point on resources. An evacuation from a residential tower block has huge resource implications for firefighters on the ground on the night. So if we're talking about now moving to a policy of evacuation, there are huge resource implications for fire and rescue services here in London and elsewhere.
Yes, but we're talking about Grenfell, we're talking about the resources at Grenfell, and the Commissioner has said that you could not have put more firefighters in the building, there could not have been more engines there, etc. So the point in this particular instance, I take on your broader point, but the point in this instance is that there was more than enough resource there at the time to do what they could do, and
I suppose
they
the question,
fought valiantly.
Susan, would be whether the London Fire Brigade assessed that if their view is now that the building should have been evacuated, would they have had the resources to evacuate the building, if that's what people are now talking about? Because I think that changes the whole debate around the resources.
The whole debate needs to be changed around stay put, but that's a separate issue.
We'll come back to stay put later on.
So.
But, you know, I mean, the point is, were there enough resources at 1:30 in the morning, which what report says is when the evacuation should have started? Anyway, that's an open question for later on. Do you want to go on to your
Yes, I'll go on to my proper questions. Do you agree, as stated in the report, that London Fire Brigade's preparation and planning for a fire such as that at Grenfell Tower was gravely inadequate? I'll start with the Commissioner, I think.
Yes. So obviously a fire of the scale and magnitude of Grenfell Tower has never been seen anywhere in the UK, and we hope it never is again. But we have identified areas where our training was inadequate and where the information we collected was inadequate. We recognise all the recommendations made in the report in response to that. Not only have we been working on those since very soon after when we found our own internal investigation, but we now have a special reporting board that looks at all the measures that are in there that will obviously feed all the recommendations into to ensure that we're taking steps to address those. But we do recognise there are areas where clearly there was insufficient training for both our firefighters, control staff and officers.
Do you mainly put it down to training, or is there anything else that you would consider was inadequate at that time?
So I think that, you know, we didn't have the fortune of some of the equipment that we've now managed to procure that would have made a difference, like the smoke evacuation hoods and possibly drones. But I think a lot of this is about the gathering of the information and the training and response to buildings. But not only that, the understanding of the fact that buildings could behave so in such a way that they shouldn't, and that the fire could spread in such a manner, and how we would respond to that. But I still have a concern that even though we now have a far greater understanding of that, that it would be very difficult to implement training to respond to some of these situations, because it is still such an extraordinary event of such a significant scale that we still have, you know, huge concerns about the fires in those types of buildings.
Has anybody else anything to add to that?
If I can, yes. I think our point on our concern on this point is not, it's partially directed at the London Fire Brigade, but it's a national point again. There were warning signs about external cladding fires. As long ago as 1999, my own union made a submission to the House of Commons Select Committee following a fire at Garnet Court in Ayrshire, where someone, one member of the public died, and we warned of the risk of external cladding fires. So the issue was should have been on the radar of the Fire and Rescue Service. And I think our concern here is that there are, in our view, no robust national structures in the Fire and Rescue Service. This is where I to some degree, sympathise with the London Fire Brigade. There are no national structures where we should be horizon scanning. We should be seeing changes, monitoring changes in the built environment. We should be jointly thinking, what are the implications of that for fire safety regimes? What are the implications for that operational response? And so on. But none of that happened. We had a fire in Melbourne. My understanding is that chief fire officers in the UK were aware and possibly even visited Melbourne in the aftermath of that fire. My question to them would be, what the hell did they do when they came back from such visits? So we should have been aware of this, and we seem not to have been.
Okay,
Well,
Roy wanted to come out.
Can I just go back to Mr. Rack? Can you at some point, either now or whenever, indicate to us who you wrote to about this?
Yes,
who you
sure.
And because obviously if you knew it, they're your members going in and out of these fires. So if you
Indeed.
can let the committee know of all the times that you've actually made that obvious. Sorry, Roy.
Yes, thank you. A couple of points I'd like to make on that. I think we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that if buildings are built properly and maintained properly, Grenfell wouldn't have happened. Yes, there were some signs about cladding fire, but Luke Bisbee, one of the expert witnesses himself, said Grenfell was unusual, mainly because of the architectural crown, the way the fire spread and moved, and it was beyond our experience. I think the other thing about the difficulty of identifying these buildings, following Grenfell, every building we identified with ASIM cladding had to have cladding removed and tested in the laboratory before we knew it was that type of cladding. So I think for firefighters on fire stations to go and look at cladding to identify it, it was just not possible. So now that's why we need that information from building owners, so we get the information to the front line.
Okay. Anybody else?
The only thing I'd add is that we would support Matt's call for a national body to make sure that you get this joined up thinking, and that actually we do get the systemic culture change that is needed to make sure that people take this learning on board.
Okay. Did you?
I'll ask it with my questions.
Oh, okay. Can I ask, what's your assessment of the way the London Fire Brigade prepares for the risk of fires in the external envelopes of high-rise residential buildings?
So clearly, having learnt from what we learnt of Grenfell Tower and the understanding now that there are large numbers of buildings that are covered in very highly flammable cladding, that's why we've now given information to our watch officers and firefighters about looking out for abnormal signs of fire spread. Obviously the buildings that we know about that have waking watches in, as I said, our firefighters are visiting those on a regular basis, not only to ensure they are familiar with the buildings, but to ensure that they are familiar with the waking watch system that's going on, so they can assist in the evacuations of those buildings in the event of a fire taking place.
I mean, given previous history of various fires, and Mr. Rax alluded to some, why was the London Fire Brigade not provided with proper training about cladding fires?
So I think, you know, as Mr. Wilsher said, that part of the issue is that cladding should not be highly flammable, and you can't recognise the flammability of cladding merely by looking at it. There have been other fires across the world where there have been external fire spread, but none of those have suffered the breaches in compartmentation that Grenfell Tower had, along with the huge numbers of really poor fire safety interventions of the building. I think with all those factors combined together, it led to the terrible tragedy that happened. It's important now that we make sure that all of our officers, right from the junior level upwards, are very alert to understanding what it looks like when a fire spreads through cladding, because part of the problem clearly is the fact that cladding is rainproof in its nature. Therefore, extinguishing a fire when the cladding has become involved is almost impossible. So it's the recognition of the fact that it's then very much about the what we do inside the building and how we put steps in place there.
Can I just put to you, page 588 of the report refers to the presentation. That the,
just coming on to that,
all right.
Thank you.
Okay, sorry. Well, you
No, go on.
Why wasn't that disseminated more widely? And why didn't you know about it?
So the tall buildings presentation was something which was put together by a group of fire engineers, predominantly around the issues of testing of cladding and flammability of cladding, and it was shared with a group of fire safety professionals. At that point, it was not shared more widely amongst the London Fire Brigade. So, very sadly, I was not aware of that presentation at that time.
Well, the question is, why wasn't it propagated more widely, and why didn't you know?
Because I think at that time it was viewed as being an issue that fire safety engineers and professionals were looking at in relation sometime towards response to building consultation and those matters. And at that time, I don't know why, but that's one of the matters that will be explored quite rightly in phase 2 as to why certain pieces of information weren't learnt and shared. What I do know now is that we have a very different system for when we identify risks, how that information is shared across London Fire Brigade.
Yeah, sorry.
Well, I was going to bring that up because, I mean, surely that is a real mistake that hadn't cascaded down.
Yeah, clearly, we've identified that had that information been shared, that it might have been easier for our officers to identify the fact that the fire was spreading through cladding. I think it would still have given them significant issues about how to address that because, as we've alluded to, and I know we're going to go on to talk about, the stay put policy is built on the building, protecting the people inside for a certain period of time and allowing us to get in there and put fires out. Once the fire's completely involving the external envelope of the building, there is no way for us to extinguish that fire.
Okay, I mean, obviously it's very unsatisfactory that given that was there and that we all knew, or those of you that needed to know that was the case, that there wasn't something in place, and certainly to protect not only residents of these buildings but also our firefighters. This is clearly a massive hazard. I'm very concerned about the information of these buildings. We touched on it earlier, that the information of these buildings isn't better kept, isn't better known, because that is part and parcel of a firefighter's job, to look at the various buildings on their site. What have you put into place now to look at this? And I think Mr. Rack said earlier that how did the building come to be in that condition? Well, are you talking internal condition as well as external?
Talking about a condition whereby every element of fire protection in the building had completely failed. Not just the cladding, but the fire doors, the fire lift, the smoke extraction system, the windows, the self-closing element on the fire door. Every single element on which firefighters would rely in a normal purpose-built residential block did not do what it was supposed to do. So that placed the firefighters...
So it was even down to self-closing doors and stuff like that. But you've said earlier that our firefighters were in and out of the building doing fire safety checks. So they would have been, if they were constantly in and out of the building, which you said earlier, Why were they not going back and reporting this?
They wouldn't simply be aware. There's no way a firefighter would understand that the cladding was flammable.
No. The internal features. I'm going inside the building now. If everything failed, then the fire doors and all of these things that would cause problems.
So the regulatory reform order doesn't give fire and rescue services the power to inspect doors and inspect self-closers. You have to make an entry into a private dwelling to do that, which is why the chair's directed his recommendation around fire doors and self-closers to the responsible person, because he recognises that the fire and rescue service is not able to achieve that.
No, I accept that. But if the building was so bad, and I accept it was, I'm not disputing that. I'm saying if firefighters were in and out, and they were in and out of homes doing fire safety checks, would they, if they saw something in a property where they went to do a home safety check, and they noticed that somebody had replaced the front door with one that wasn't a proper fire retardant front door, that they'd drilled lots of holes in for sky or something, and therefore you couldn't compartmentalise the fire, would they go back and say something to anybody, or would they just do their fire safety check and ignore everything around them that caused this issue?
I was going to say, so we do have a process in place for that. If it's obvious to them that there are issues within the building, then there is a station notification process where they would pass that information to fire safety officers who are able to go and assess that situation. But very often the ability to see where those problems lie is not immediately obvious to firefighters, and without some sort of invasive scrutiny, it would not even be obvious to fire safety inspectors or fire engineers.
Okay, so with all the visits to the home safety fire, did anything come back from firefighters that there was anything wrong or concerning in the building?
So we issued a notice of deficiencies in November 2016 to Kensington and Chelsea Borough, identifying a number of deficiencies within the building following a routine audit or inspection, and those issues we were informed by Kensington and Chelsea were being addressed, and we would hope they would be picked up in the responsible person's fire risk assessment.
Do we ever go back to double check that anything's been done?
So we do for when we when we issue a notice of enforcement for the notice of deficiencies, we don't currently do that, and I think that's one of the things we need to look at in the future. But you'll recognise that London Fire Brigade, with a huge built environment that we cover, addressing every notice of deficiency in the past is problematic. But I think, given what we know now, I think that's something that we have to look at going forward.
And so, do I have your assurance you will be looking at that going forward?
Yes.
And that has resource implications, presumably.
Yes, it would have massive resource implications, because the amount of notice of deficiency that we issue on a regular basis would mean we'd need a huge increase in our fire safety staff to allow us to go back and inspect to ensure those works have been carried out.
Okay.
On this point?
Yes, on this specific point. How much obligation is there on building owners and managers to inform you when they've made changes to a building prior to you conducting, or even after you've conducted inspections? Are they obliged to ask for a re-inspection at that point? And when you issue a notice of deficiency, how far are building owners and managers required to implement what you have identified?
If Mark could answer that, because actually he leads on protection. I'm not a regulatory reform expert by any stretch.
Yeah, if I can pick up on some of the other points that Andy was making earlier here. I mean, I would expect firefighters across the country going out and doing safer home visits, whatever the fire service calls them, in individual premises, might pick up some of the issues if they were obvious, but I suspect that would be on the minority of occasions, because most of the fire safety deficiencies that we come across in buildings wouldn't be immediately obvious to a firefighter. Might be more obvious to a fire safety inspecting officer going in and doing a proper substantial audit of that premises. But even then, what they're auditing is the fire risk assessment that's been carried out by the competent person for that building, and not necessarily pulling apart elements of the building to check the internal compartmentation, because that's not what...
You would be reliant then on the owner or manager of a building who changes it to tell you exactly what the changes are that they've made, and if they don't do that, is there any kind of obligation on them to do that?
If they're making substantial changes to the building that impact on the fire safety of that building, then there is a proper process through building regulations that they would need to go to, and the fire service would be involved and engaged in that at the appropriate time. I think this comes right to the heart of a lot of the issues that Dame Judith Hackett identified in her independent review, and the NFCC was firmly plugged into that with colleagues from the London Fire Brigade supporting that as well. And she called it a broken system and talked about the issues with competence and culture of the system, playing back into some of the points that Matt said earlier about the culture within the system beyond the fire and rescue service.
Well, it's a point that I've raised before, as Dany and Fiona know, that I know that they when they make big changes, that you can then make recommendations from the fire service, but there is then no obligation on them to implement any of those changes at all, is there?
That's right, and that is what we often find.
I wouldn't call that a broken system. I would personally call that no system at all. What about the point where after you've issued the notice of deficiency, is there really any obligation? Obviously, if you've issued a notice and you're saying, you want to enforce, that's different. After issuing a notice of deficiency, is there any obligation on the building owner or manager to implement the items identified?
If we issue a notice of deficiency, then the expectation is that the responsible person will address and deal with those notices and the deficiencies in the building and put them right in that building. And once they've done that, they will then be back into a position where they've got a suitable and sufficient fire risk assessment for that building.
But we've identified that many of the deficiencies couldn't necessarily be seen unless you rip the building apart, and so people not telling you the changes they're making is obviously the more important part of my question. Thank you.
Okay, going slightly back again. Are you confident that the information recorded on the ORDS or the operational response database is accurate, as Grenfell was not? Is everything else being looked at rapidly?
We have a project in place at the moment that is reviewing all of our information that's stored on the operational risk database, and we're introducing a new technology system to enable us to assist with that. In the meantime, we are working with the technology we have and the tablets we have on fire engines to ensure that information is available. It's an ongoing project and a piece of work we're looking at closely at the moment.
Yeah, because those tablets have been available for quite some time now, haven't they? Yeah. And it's that isn't being updated properly.
So it's ensuring that the right information is available on those tablets, not only, of course, for the crews that work on those fire stations ground, but any crews that come onto those different fire grounds to make sure they have access to that information.
Yeah, I understand that. Are you confident that fire crews are suitably qualified to carry out Section 72D visits? If not, what does need to be addressed?
So what we are doing clearly is reviewing some of the information that is in our own policy on how crews go out and collect that information. The information that was on there was a very comprehensive list, which clearly some areas were not being complied with. So that is part of the review of the whole operational risk information project we're doing at the moment.
Okay, and what does the Brigade's operational risk information project involve? Is that all around that?
So it's all around the information we collect and how we share that information, how we update that information.
Right. Will you ensure, as recommended in the report, that the LFB review and revised, and I'm sorry for anybody watching this that doesn't know these things, the PN 633, so that it fully reflects the principles in GRA 3.2. Obviously, the GRA 3.2, if you look at it, is far more extensive than your PN 63. So, if not, why not?
So just for clarification for anyone watching, PN 633 is our current high-rise firefighting policy. We're doing the work at the moment on updating that policy and ensuring it complies fully with the GRA. That is something that we will continue with the work we're doing. It is something that we have been doing over the past months as well, because we recognise there are some areas that there are gaps between the GRA and our own policy.
And the guidance and the training that you issued over the summer also related to that, didn't it?
Yes.
Okay. Are you going to ensure that all officers of the rank of crew manager and above are trained in carrying out those requirements on the PN 63?
Yes, we do, and so we have the information we share via the operational news, which many of you will be familiar with. On the back of that, there is a requirement for mandatory training for our firefighters and our officers and crews. That information is stored electronically, so we're able to at any time inspect to see who has completed that. And if it gets to the end of the time in which they should have completed and it hasn't, it flags up to us that that training has not taken place. It's something we're closely monitoring.
What period of time do you allow them to be trained within?
So that is the training for this one's been the quarter, 3 months, so it's every quarter. So this is the end of this one. I think it's in December when this piece of training, but I'm very pleased to say I did go on and look at it, and 2 weeks ago I think 88% of the watches had completed the high-rise training way before the end of the quarter because they recognise the importance of it.
Good, well that's good. I finished that section, shall I start?
We're going to move on to the incident ground. I think we're going to take the first question.
Okay, so this is the incident ground. Incident command at the Grenfell Tower remained with a junior officer for nearly an hour. When more senior officers arrived, did they take the right steps to gain situational awareness and issue commands accordingly?
So we recognise, obviously, with the rapid escalation of the fire at Grenfell Tower, that the watch manager was in charge of the incident for far longer than is normal and is deemed suitable. Despite the fact that other operational officers did arrive, they undertook duties that they considered to be more significant and important in relation to fire survival guidance calls at that moment. It's obviously not ideal for any of our watch officers to be in charge of such a large-scale incident for a long period of time. Although they're trained to be in charge, anything of that level of significance, they would have required additional support. We have looked at the response times of our officers getting to the incident itself, and we constantly monitor those at all times, and we have a requirement for officers to be available within certain periods of times. But it's not ideal under any circumstance for a watch manager who is obviously just in charge of a fire station to be in charge for that significant length of time.
So you accept that that is totally unacceptable?
Yeah, it's unacceptable, although there were other officers on the fire ground who were in conversation with the watch manager and were giving additional support and guidance. They didn't actually take control and take over the incident.
More senior officers?
Yeah, there were station managers on the incident ground who then took the role of looking at fire survival guidance information.
So how long did it take for an AC to get in situ?
First Assistant Commissioner arrived at 02:31, so some hour and a half after the incident started. He was paged and informed as a remote monitoring officer much earlier. He had to come across from South East London across to northeast to northwest London, obviously.
Are you going to, I mentioned this in our last meeting, are you going to be looking at making sure that there are senior officers more centrally on going forward? Because I totally accept to have such a junior officer responsible for this was, if nothing else, grossly unfair to him or her.
Yeah, Tim, so obviously the Assistant Commissioner was four levels up from the watch manager, so we had station managers, group managers and Deputy Assistant Commissioners who were on the fire ground far sooner than that because they were mobilised and attended much sooner. The issue around our officers, it depends on whereabouts they live in London and what other calls are going on, but we will look at our officer distribution. One of the things we've said we are pleased about is that we have reinstalled our camp-out bases so that our senior officers can stay in venues in central London if they live outside of the London area. We will review where our officers are available.
Good, because I mentioned this last time. When was that reinstalled then?
The camp-out bases were installed not long after I became Commissioner.
Oh, okay, because you didn't mention it last time. But they're not obliged to stay there if they live outside London?
No, so if they live outside London, they have to provide a base inside London to respond from. But if they live inside London, then they can respond from their home address.
Okay, all right.
And just to follow this up, reading this report, it looks as though there was no command and control at all, from what I can make out, that was coordinated until Andy Rowe got there. And now really that isn't satisfactory, and I think you've accepted that. When Andy Rowe got there, just about the first thing he did was to reverse the stay put policy, and that's one of the criticisms, that it should have been done well an hour earlier than he got there. And Susan's made the point about the camp-out bases, which were abolished by Brian Coleman, then brought back, as you say, earlier this year. But it does seem to me that take an hour and a half for a senior officer to get there is just not acceptable. And although you say you've got performance times for senior officers to get to incidents, I really do think those performance times have to be looked at again for turnout. We know it's 6 minutes to get the first pump there and 8 minutes for the second pump and so forth. How long is it, the attendance time for a senior officer of AC rank or above?
So there is no attendance time because there's only one Assistant Commissioner on duty across the whole of London in any 24-hour period. So it would purely depend on where the fire is and where they're located at night. If we were to wish to have an attendance time, we would need to have multiple Assistant Commissioners on duty, and that would mean increasing our assistant commissioners from the 5 we have currently to probably 20.
Well, I'm not saying there's only 20 senior officers or DACs, but I do think we've got to have a system where we can get somebody who can get a grip on this sort of incident much, much quicker. It's just not acceptable for it to take an hour and a half for somebody to get there, to get a grip, which is what Andy wrote. I think of all the firefighters, he's the one that seems to come through as having actually got a grip on what was going on, despite you have officers of DAC and below. And I just don't think that's acceptable to Londoners, frankly. Sean?
To sort of continue where my two colleagues have started, what changes have been made to policies and training to ensure that senior officers inform themselves quickly enough of conditions and operations at an incident? Because the report does suggest that nobody knew what was going on. And we've talked about Andy Robe, but surely there must be some kind of system where you arrive to an incident and somebody brings you up to speed. Is that in place?
That's always been in place. So the situation is that whatever the level of incident, we provide a senior officer appropriate to that level of incident. They also have an additional senior officer who's called a monitoring officer who comes on. And when the senior officer comes on, they liaise with the previous senior officer and have a conversation about the situation on the incident ground. I think the difficulty of Grenfell Tower was not only the rapid escalation of the incident, but the sheer volume of people involved and the fire spread involved that meant that it was a very confused picture, understandably, because of the nature of what was happening at the incident ground.
But aren't all fires a confused situation? What part of your training, why have you not looked at the training that senior officers are subject to? Because of course it only takes you to look out the window to realise that we have hundreds of different types of buildings of different ages, so any fire in any one of those buildings is going to be complicated. Is this not reflected in training?
I don't think we can underestimate the completely unprecedented and unexpected nature of the incident and the impact that had and the stress that applied to those incident commanders. I think this was something we've never seen anywhere in London. We've never seen anything along the scale of this anywhere in the country. And I take Matt's point about other cladding fires, but we've never seen a cladding fire that fully envelops a building. And I think we've recognised that those human factors, the impact of acute stress on those individuals may have played a part in that incident. And so we're now looking at work to see to what extent human factors are embedded within our policy and training, how we can make people more resilient when they're faced with those really unexpected type events, so they can continue to perform in the way that we would expect them to and is set out in our normal policies and procedures.
But this is my point. If we separate the human factors for a second, because everybody knows that a blazing building is going to be a distressing situation, certainly one of this size, where are the procedures? What went wrong and what are you doing to change them? Because again, the report really strongly suggests that A, people were slow to turn up, and that B, there was no understanding of what was happening, and that's before I get to the fact that the radio system didn't seem to work. Or are you aware of that, Commissioner, that your radios don't work? I mean, that to me seems like 101. Do these things work?
So the incident was a huge communications challenge for us, probably the largest communications challenge that any fire and rescue service certainly across the country. More than 300 personal radios potentially in use at any one time. It's a simplex radio system, therefore if one person's talking, no one else can talk. So there needs to be absolute radio discipline. We do accept that there were some signal propagation issues within the building, but as I say, I don't think we can underestimate the impact of the stress on those individuals from such an unprecedented incident. You're absolutely right that any fire that you turn up to non-fire service people looks like an issue, but we deal with those things day in, day out. This was completely unprecedented, and which is why we've put in place that if these things are going to happen again in the future, these types of building fires or terrorist incidents, how do we make our people more resilient and be able to continue to perform in those circumstances?
But this is, again, I'll say one more time, this is separate to the people. I'm suggesting that you need to look at the procedures and before that point, the training. For instance, when we had the King's Cross fire, that was unprecedented. Surely the lesson to learn from that is you have to have, some robust system of speaking to people who are meant to be dealing with things, and secondly, actually all fire, certainly anything above a sort of waste paper bin fire, is of an unprecedented nature. So therefore you should build structures to deal with some of that, because this looks like fundamental failure. The idea that your radios don't work is simply not acceptable, because you know in any given fire you're going to need to speak to your colleagues.
And we are looking at our procedures and we are looking at our policy and training, and I don't think you can completely separate out the human factors. Those things are intertwined, and I think we need to increase the resilience of people.
Sorry, let me restate that. The reason I say separate out the human factors is in order so you can support those people. Because obviously, the bit that did go right, firefighters got there very quickly. They leapt to the task. That's beyond doubt that people showed great personal levels of self-sacrifice. They got into the building, they did their best. My point about separating out, before you can ask people, in this case, to put their life on the line, you at least have to have the training and the tactics involved. We've just had a conversation about how long it took senior people to get there. Had nobody considered that it would take people time to get across a very, very large city.
Yeah, and that's why we have a number of senior officers on duty at any one time in London. The rank that we were talking about, there is only one person, but at any one time there are several numbers of station managers, group managers and deputy assistant commissioners on time to be able to provide that cover across London. The radio issue, there was no radio system that would have been sufficient on the night to deal with the volume of information that was being relayed. We have looked into new radio technology now, and part of that is looking into a different way of operating. Some of the issues with fire brigade radios is quite rightly in the past they've looked at being intrinsically safe, which means that they can't in themselves cause a spark to cause an explosion to happen, but that means it very much limits the radio frequency and ability to people to communicate. So we've been looking at different ways of addressing that issue as part of our radio replacement project. Part of the issue with Grenfell was the sheer volume and numbers of people attempting to use the radio to communicate from inside the tower to outside the tower and share information across the fire ground. We do provide all our firefighters and officers with training, both from the initial basic training they receive as being a firefighter, right through and up to including officer training. But so this incident did present a number of completely unique challenges. That's why we've looked at a number of those aspects. That's why I committed to doing an independent review of the training of London Fire Brigade, which is a report I commissioned that we've recently received at my Commissioner's Board that I've undertaken. Will come here and share the findings of, to look at areas where we can address those issues that we've identified.
Could I just add that actually you might find it of interest to read the update report that the Brigade presented to the last extraordinary meeting, which outlines sort of what the Brigade has found on a number of these issues and what they've already got in train to deal with them. So I can make sure that we send you a copy of that after the meeting.
Okay, thank you for that. Do you agree that the LFB should be looking at these policies and ensuring, of course the answer is yes, that you should be looking at these policies and ensuring the changes? Can you give me an idea of some of the things you've done? And I just want to go back to a comment, I think Matt, so you used the term horizon scanning to looking at what could be happening. Because again, I go to my comment, in London we have a crazy assortment of buildings, and we could produce this level of fire again. Just look at the buildings over the road, full of more people than would have been in Grenfell. Are you constantly looking at what we could be changing? Are you testing yourselves? Are you practicing? Because one of the things that comes out of the report, that an awful lot of it looked like a shock, and Andy keeps talking about the unprecedented nature of it. But if you sat in your office and horizon scanned in the way Matt was suggesting, you would arrive very quickly at a very complicated situation. What are you doing to figure out what happens for the next one?
So obviously the work of London Fire Brigade is about looking at the risk to London and assessing that risk and ensuring we provide training to firefighters in recognition of the known risk we have in London. So not only do we use a lot of our data to identify the operational incidents that we are attending day in, day out, we share information with our colleagues nationally about the picture of what's happening and around the world. I think the circumstances, and the reason Andy makes reference to it, is that the circumstances of Grenfell have never happened before, and we pray never happen again. The spectacular failure of the building and the way the fire spread and developed throughout that building, inside and outside, is something that should never happen if the building had been built correctly. So the assessments we do and the buildings we look at now, as you say, if you look opposite the building here, you'll see many high-rise buildings. Those are buildings that are built with a number of fire safety regulations, with a number of protection and prevention measures inside those buildings. We look at those buildings, we train to those, but the circumstances of Grenfell, of those number of factors combining together, that is something that was completely unexpected to us.
How familiar would any fire station be with its high-risk buildings? I wonder, would Grenfell, the local fire station, would that have been flagged up on their system as high risk?
Grenfell should never have been a high-risk building. It should have been a high-rise building that protected the residents inside it. The fire should have been able to stay confined to the compartment of origin for 60 minutes, and had Grenfell been built correctly and not covered in flammable cladding, it would have protected the people in there. So high-rise buildings, our firefighters visit those buildings so they understand things like where to plug into the dry riser to supply water, where to park, where the fire lifts are, all those things they do familiarise themselves with. Unfortunately, what they can't see is the unknown. They can't understand the condition inside those buildings where fire safety breaches have been made, or where the outside of the building has been covered in completely inappropriate material.
So wouldn't this single staircase flag up to somebody that is a high-risk building?
No, because the building should never be designed to be evacuated, and that's the problem, because buildings like Grenfell Tower that have a single staircase are not designed for mass evacuation, because they're designed that the stay-put policy should work, the fire should remain contained to the compartment of origin, which allows the fire service to attend the incident and extinguish the fire without it spreading and without it putting the rest of the residents at risk. A single staircase is not designed for mass evacuation.
More questions, by the way.
Excuse me, sorry, I'm new to this committee, I'm sorry. I'm good. That's enough for me, Chair.
Okay, thanks. Well, I want to just follow on communication
I'm doing
at the fire ground. I mean, it does seem to me like it's something out of the 19th century when you're relying on runners to take fire survival guidance calls from one place to another on the fire ground. That seems to be a recipe for duplication, things getting missed and so forth. I mean, runners rather than radios it must be 200 years out of date. Anyway, we know that you're looking at radios, and I know from the King's Cross fire, the work I did there, that radios were a problem there because they wouldn't work underground. But what I want to look at is the communication or lack of it between the control room and the incident command, which is obviously a very important two-way channel. And on the one hand, we had the fire service control thinking the fire was contained on floor 4, despite what was coming in from what people were telling them when they were phoning in on 999. And on the other hand, we had incident commanders not really knowing what was going on in fire survival guidance calls because of the confusion around that. So the first point is, do you agree that what the report says about the need for regular active communication between control and incident commanders, and why wasn't that done?
We've accepted in our own preliminary reports that was an issue. We accept that communication should have taken place and didn't take place. At the moment, we don't fully understand the reason for that. We can surmise that actually both the control room and the incident ground was completely overwhelmed. I'm sorry to keep using that word, but I think that is relevant. But we've accepted that is the case. And I think actually within phase 2, I think the chair will look at that and explore that issue fully, and we'll come to a conclusion or finding around why that happened. But in the meantime, we are trying to address those issues. Control and operational staff have undertaken a large number of exercises to try and inform what our fire survival guidance policy looks like going forward. We hope government will help us in terms of research into how we respond to these types of buildings and types of incidents that are of this unprecedented nature, and that will further inform both national policy and our own local policies.
Yeah, because I mean, some of these problems aren't new. They came out of the Lakenhall House recommendations in terms of what was going on in control, and we'll come back to control later on. But it does seem to me bizarre that you've got all these calls, 999 calls coming in, and control keep telling the people that they don't know what they're talking about, even though the flat's full of smoke. That doesn't seem to me a very satisfactory way of going on. But why wasn't there at least an informative sent from the incident command to control saying this is going all the way up the building?
Well, we accept that should have taken place. So there was an informative message sent at 01:15, and then it was, I think, 02:30 or something before the next informative was sent. That is not normal. Normally, we would expect an informative message to be sent every 20 or 30 minutes at most. That didn't happen. And again, I'll use the word overwhelmed. I think they were overwhelmed on scene, and I think they probably had other priorities at the time, but that doesn't excuse that the control room were left.
You're sending an informative at 1:30, you could add in, and by the way, the whole lot's up, gone up.
I don't disagree, and we've accepted that in our own preliminary reports. We know that that's an issue, and we're trying to address those issues. But what I think is not right to do is speculate on why those things took place in advance of what the inquiry wants to do during
I see Matt
phase
wants to
two.
come in, but before I bring Matt in, how are you addressing this issue? What are you doing to address this issue?
So we are looking at our policies, both our high-rise firefighting policy. We're looking at our fire survival guidance policy. As soon as we've agreed what a new procedure looks like for fire survival guidance, we will change and review our emergency call handling procedure. There's a lot of work going on within control at the moment. In Ops News 37 recently, we've reinforced the need for exchanging information. So that's the work we're doing at the moment, and we'll continue in the enhanced training that we're doing for incident commanders. The communications issue and the need to share information promptly will be reinforced.
Matt, you wanted to come in?
I just wanted to make a point on the communications between incident command at those earlier stages. And I pick up a point that Commissioner Cotton made about in the later stages of the incident, the London Fire Brigade have systems of monitoring officers. So it strikes me that when very senior managers are on the ground, they have monitor officers to support them and to assist them in their decision making. Actually, the person in the crux of this at the most crucial time has no such systems of support. That's a watch manager. So actually, what we perhaps need to look at is why doesn't that person at that early stage of the incident have additional resources in terms of communicating directly with control, in terms of how he or she is making those decisions, because it strikes me that's when that's, and there are resource implications there as well.
Commissioner.
So in order to address that, one of the things that we've done recently is you'll be aware is we've undertaken a project that has changed our rank structure, which means that from the very early stages our more junior officers will have the support of a senior officer on the fire ground of a station officer that will go there to provide that additional support and guidance to them. We're also not only exploring different ways of training but new technologies. For instance, as I spoke to you about at a previous meeting here around the 999 technology, so that we can ask people who are on an incident ground to capture video and send it to us, so our control officers will have that real-time up-to-date information available to them so they can get better situational awareness.
Do you want to say anything about communications on the fire ground with control?
I can only reiterate what colleagues from London Fire Brigade have said about the difficulty of so many people trying to communicate. I think what we do need to look at is data, digital and technology to help us in future, and things like 999i, different systems to communicate between control and control units, so we have that dedicated source, are things we're going to have to look at, and we'll go back to resources and assistance probably from government to make sure we have that implemented across the country.
Okay, so this might be one for Andy now. What exercises has the Brigade undertaken to test the interface and transfer of information between control, command and Brigade?
As part of the review of our fire survival guidance policy, I think there have been 6 exercises that have taken place that involve control, senior officers and operational staff. They've tried to simulate multiple fire survival guidance calls to try and identify where those challenges take place, how the mutual aid arrangements between control figure into that. And I'm assured that actually we are getting close to a procedure for multi-survival guidance calls, and that will be published when Policy Note 790 is republished next year. But there are other issues around the exchange of information between control rooms who are providing mutual aid to us. That was severely challenged on the night, so a number of controls supported London Fire Brigade on the night, but it's clear that there were really no national protocols in terms of how we exchanged information with them, and that needs to be addressed going forwards, and NFCC with ourselves are looking at that going forward.
Okay, can I... Sorry? Yeah. Before I start that one, can you tell me, do you think if you'd been based at the other control room, Merton control room, rather than Stratford, things would have been better?
I think that had the control staff been there, they would have had more tools available to them, so they would have had the large screen television. Obviously there was an issue as well with the downlink from the police helicopter, which would have provided situational awareness. So there's a number of things that were better when they were in place at the normal control room at Merton than they were at Stratford. However, we have taken steps since then to update the fallback control room at Stratford to ensure they've got better situational awareness.
Okay, is there a space for one of those great big screens?
So there isn't space at Stratford
No.
for one of the large scale screens there is, but we have ensured they do have a visual system of being aware, because at that time the television system wasn't working, so they have got a system that would enable them to be able to view images from the fireground now.
Was it not working because it...
We've got Assembly Member Shah who's joined us to replace Assembly Member Javal.
Was it not working because it was down, or not working because it wasn't there?
So they had a television screen, a small scale TV, but not the facility we have in the large control room, which is able to provide the links and information.
You said the television system wasn't working.
But the small one wasn't switched on either, was it?
No. Just wasn't switched on because it wasn't working, or...
It just wasn't switched on.
I don't think the evidence is clear on that.
Well, yeah, that's not good, is it? Did anybody ask for it to be switched on, or is that just a void that we don't know why that wasn't on?
I think at this moment in time that's a void. We don't know why it's on. I'm not clear on that, and I don't think the inquiry is clear on that either.
Because that would have helped. Okay. In what ways are fire and rescue services across the UK using modern communication techniques to provide a direct line of communication between the control room and the bridgehead? We've touched on that. Is there anything else you want to, Roy?
Sorry, that's the communication directly between the control room and the bridgehead. I don't think I know of a fire service that does that at the moment, because that's not within the command and control policy. I think it's something we're going to look at seriously. We need to consider what the unintended consequences that might be with that direct communication that cuts out the command structure. So I think as a group with the policy look, we need to look at whether that's the best way of operating that way. I think the solution is getting the correct information to the bridgehead. Whether it's direct from control, we're not quite sure of yet.
Okay, have we got any timelines on when this might be discussed and decisions made, or?
Well, as Commissioner Cotton and others have said, we're now looking at the recommendations. We've accepted those. We're setting up, in fact, as National Fire Chiefs Council, we're reprioritising our national work. We have a meeting of all the Chief Fire Officers next week to reprioritise our work to make Grenfell a priority work for us. We're reviewing our strategy as well, so that would be the thing. We'll be concentrating on working with government and London Fire Brigade to look at all those recommendations and implement them as soon as possible.
I'll ask now, I know I'll forget. I mean, Matt made a very good point earlier about things being suggested at inquests and things like that, and ideas being put through. Matt said that they've actually asked before. The thing is, these things with inquests, and goodness knows what goes on and on and on for years, and then lots of these points are lost, and then they're only brought back again when something occurs. So who is collating all this information? Because there are so many failures, even little ones like the television's not going on or whatever else. There's so many failures here that it really does need to be brought into an area and all of it addressed in a timely way, really. Who will take that on board?
Well, I think, as I said at the beginning, the Mayor's quite clear that he, as he said last week, is taking personal responsibility for making sure that this is driven forward. And I'd welcome the opportunity to sit down with lead members and discuss what format you would like that piece of work to look like when it comes back as a report to you. Because I think it is about assurance to the Mayor, but it's also about assurance to yourselves and assurance to the public and the community and to the government that actually things are being implemented. And I think I made the point at our last meeting that it's okay to say that you're learning the lessons. Actually, the bigger thing is actually making sure that change is embedded, and unless change is embedded, the points that Matt made earlier about sort of people have seen things in the past and it's not always sort of become part of the practice. This is about sort of making sure that we do get the detail right, but we also get that bigger picture and that systemic change both within the fire brigades in London but across the whole sector, to make sure that we make sure that the system is right, that the culture is right, to drive things forward and make sure that nothing like this ever happens again.
Yes, sadly, I'm sure we've heard that before, and so we really
Yeah,
must.
I know, but I think if we can sit down and talk through what reporting you would like to see as a committee, I think that would be helpful.
Okay. I think Mark wants to.
I think there absolutely is a role for National Fire Chiefs Council alongside London Fire Brigade and every other fire service in the country there together, whether it's through national operational learning arrangements that are in place that influences national operational guidance that is then rolled out consistently across every fire service in the country, and we don't end up at a risk where every fire service interprets things in a slightly different way and then applies it in their service in a slightly different way. I think within that we need to make sure that where we are bringing about change, that change is brought about in a properly considered way and then embedded into fire and rescue services in a way that then can be sustained over an extended period of time. So where we attend particularly difficult, complex incidents, and on occasions things that have happened in the past that we wouldn't want to have happened will sometimes happen again, but that is by exception rather than becomes the norm.
The trouble, and the properly considered is correct, but properly considered, we all know, sitting on committees, means years and years and years, and it leaves the door open for other things. I would agree with that,
and I think we absolutely need to avoid that as well.
Yes, we do. Matt?
I think your question goes to the heart of what we've got to think about, and that is how do we ensure that actually that this isn't just a lot of words that we're all putting out now, and actually we do have the cultural change that Fiona spoke of, because the truth is many of these warnings were there. Whether it was on the scale of Grenfell is open to debate, but certainly there were significant warnings about the threat to compartmentation in buildings in the UK, particularly following Lakanal House. There are, as you've referred to, previous incidents where in many cases firefighters have died, coroners have made recommendations. Interestingly, time and again, issues come up about communications, issues come up about command and control, issues come up about training. These are common themes, and the truth is, if, just picking up Mark's point, if what we're going to say is actually we'll just hand this back to the same people who've been there overseeing this for years, I have to say I don't find that convincing. We need something fundamentally different if we're going to actually seriously change the culture in relation to fire and rescue policy in the UK. Simply saying that the National Fire Chiefs Council, who have been in place for several years, and their predecessors, CFOA, who've actually overseen the fragmentation of the fire service, that will not convince us, and I don't think it will convince the public that that's a mechanism to resolve the very fundamental issues that we've got to grapple with.
Right. Is the Brigade on schedule to deliver improvements to its fire safety guidance, policies and procedures and associated training by the end of 2019?
Yes.
Good. That's the sort of answer I like, positively. And you'll let us know if anything does not occur, if it isn't completed.
Yes, we'll update you, of course.
Good, thank you. What exactly do those improvements involve?
So they involve information we share with our frontline firefighters and how we provide training for them to do their core role of when they go out to view premises. But not only that, it's about ensuring that we have the fire safety inspecting officers available to provide that service that's the next level up effectively, because obviously our frontline firefighters are not all fire safety inspection experts, and they couldn't do that in conjunction with their day job. It's a highly specialised role that they do, so it's ensuring we make sure we have those fire safety officers. And the conversations we have had here before about the problem is that currently there is a shortage of those professionals available to fire services, and part of that is due to the fact that clearly there's a massive impact on the private sector who offer a great deal better financial reward to people to go and work in the fire safety market there than there is in the public sector, and it takes a long while to train up our fire safety officers to a proficient level because it's such a detailed qualification they have to have. So it's about ensuring that not only do we have those fire safety staff in place, but that we retain them as well, because obviously there is considerable interest in the outside market in trying to effectively, you know, procure them from us. So it is about ensuring that we look after our staff that we have, because they have got a massive work impact at the moment, and obviously their work impact has increased so hugely since Grenfell that they've been working, you know, huge additional hours in order to meet the requirements. So our high-rise task force that we put in place that went out to do those specific inspections on high-rise buildings, we've now transferred that into a far wider task force, and as you know, we've come in before and had conversations about, for instance, the inspections on places like care homes that we've had to widen to because of the defects we found in those. So it is about, you know, maintaining our high level of professionally qualified officers as well.
I'm assuming it's much worse since Grenfell because the private sector have picked up a lot on this now, haven't they?
Absolutely, and we know that a lot of our professional fire engineers and fire safety officers have been made very lucrative offers by the private sector to go and work there because the volume of work that's been increased. But luckily, the vast majority of those are very dedicated public sector servants and have not taken that offer and have chosen to stay with London Fire Brigade.
Okay, last question on this side really. What action is being taken to ensure arrangements are made for information about the number and source of fire safety guidance calls to be communicated to the incident commanders?
So the whole issue that we were talking about around fast fire guidance and how we share that information, we've done a number of exercises. We are currently working on reviewing our policy, but we're also looking at new technology systems, and you'll see from the recommendations that Sir Martin Morbick made about talking about how we could share that information via technology, and we have been looking into those. Obviously there are a number of systems where you can have that information and relay it as a two-way. There is, Roy said, there is no fire and rescue service at the moment that has that function available, but it's something that we need to work on nationally and not just the London Fire Brigade.
Okay, I'll leave it there, thank you.
So we now go on to evacuation of Tower Stay Put and Leonie Cooper.
Thank you very much. Can I just preface what I'm going to say by saying that I, as one of the Assembly members who represents a particular part of London, Merton and Wandsworth, have taken the opportunity to talk to the people on the watches from both Merton and Wandsworth who were mobilised on that night, and I've had some discussion with them about the impact of being at Grenfell. And I think it's a massive understatement on the part of any member of the public to not understand the full scale of what occurred. I wasn't there, and I can only go on what people who were there have directly said to me. And I think we all need to, metaphorically, take our hats off to the people who were there. And it's very difficult because a lot has been now said about evacuation. A lot of accusations, I feel, have flowed from part one of the report, and that is not being contextualised, as far as I'm concerned, with the state of the building, which is going to, and how we came to have the building in the state that it was. And we've touched very briefly on the failure of the compartmentalisation, the fact that people had breached it internally, the fact that on the outside of the building were rain screens that were flammable, but also they were rain screens, so obviously putting a hose against a rain screen, it's not very easy to put the fire out. The fact that it was then galloping throughout the building, and all of those things. So I find it quite difficult that the comments about evacuation have been made in that kind of empty context. I haven't even mentioned the failure of the fire lift or problems with the dry risers and all the rest of it. But I do know that in my local stations, they've got maps of estates, they've got maps of buildings, they've got a lot of real detail. And I feel very confident that where adjustments have been communicated back to the fire service, that locally and across London, that there is a lot of effort that has gone into being able to respond properly. Now that said, there are a series of recommendations in the report around evacuation versus stay put. And it's not really been done in the context of the state of the building, I feel. But there is a call for new national guidelines, and I'm actually just going to see, is there anybody here on this panel who doesn't agree that there should not be new national guidelines? Does everyone feel that that is the case? I can see that Matt might want to come in on that point.
I suppose it's a question. I think there's a prior issue to guidelines being issued, and that is to examine what are the possibilities of evacuation in those circumstances. Because I'll repeat the point I made earlier, that to my knowledge has never happened in a building in the UK so far, and London Fire Brigade colleagues have set out, you know, the design of those buildings, a single staircase. They are designed, they were built, and the architects designed them with a view of not evacuating them in the event of a fire. So we are talking about a complete change in policy in a building that was designed for a completely different policy. We have raised that point with government ministers, and I have to say, I think the sort of exercises we envisaged could have been done very quickly after Grenfell. We could have identified buildings, we could have filled them up with people, we could have taken architectural advice, fire engineering advice and so on, looked at the issue of smoke movement and so on, the behaviour of people, and tested it, and then we could have developed ideas as to what you might be able to do if you decided to evacuate a building. Because our concern with the narrative in the report is that firstly, it differs from what some of the expert witnesses say. The report seems to differ in terms from Barbara Lane, for example, but it doesn't give advice about how that decision should have been made. And secondly, it doesn't give advice about how the evacuation could have been carried out. And those are two pretty fundamental points for firefighters to consider if we shift from stay put to evacuation. So I think there's a much bigger thing before national guidance is issued.
I can see lots of nodding to that. I mean, that is my concern, is that the idea of the 200 people from the building, 40 engines with all those firefighters all on one staircase that by that stage is filled with smoke, I do wonder how effective that evacuation could potentially actually have been for anybody. Mark.
I was just going to put to Dany, I raised with you, just pick up Matt's point, so I don't want to lose it. Matt's made the point about an exercise, and I raised this with you 3 weeks ago as well. I mean, if the Brigade could put on something like Exercise Unified Response that she did 2 or 3 years ago, an enormous exercise involving brigades from all over the country and indeed internationally, why is it beyond the wit of the LFB to organise an exercise to try and see what happens when you try to evacuate a block like Grenfell?
So, obviously, Exercise Unified Response was a large-scale exercise that took us a number of months, in fact years, to design and plan. I think the point that Matt made is well made, that what you need to understand is not just about filling a tower block full of people, telling them there's an exercise and evacuation. That's a very different set of circumstances to evacuating people in the middle of the night in a dark and smoky environment filled with, overlaid with anxiety, fear and panic. That would be very difficult to replicate. But what we would be
Exercise Unified Response, you used that organisation of mock victims, what they call. I mean,
yeah, so the casualty
they're pretty good at replicating that sort of thing, aren't they?
Absolutely, but what we would like to do is to seek to overlay that first to understand things like the smoke behaviour in the building, as well as evacuation planning for the building. And that's why we've called on the government to do this research, to understand what happens when you have a building like that, where you overlay it with smoke and then you try to evacuate people who may have differing abilities, you know, the way people might have people who are younger children or older people with them who are slower to move. It would be, you know, very difficult for us to replicate those circumstances, but we would welcome the opportunity to work with government and to work with colleagues to actually simulate those circumstances to give a better understanding. And we know that as part of phase 2, that all those modellings are going to be looked at, because I think we need to, not only do we have the very detailed explanations from the firefighters who were inside the tower, but from the residents inside the tower in a minute-by-minute circumstance to understand how rapidly changing those events were. So the situation on one landing was changing between 1 minute and the next as to the smoke conditions. So I think we need to overlay all those factors to truly understand, but then to understand the ability of us to be able to, as you say, with all those firefighters, with their firefighting equipment, wearing breathing apparatus, which a staircase which is just over 1 metre wide, which is 2 people standing side by side, for those people going into the building to attempt to rescue people and to put the fire out, met with a mass of people trying to evacuate from that building. It's a very challenging set of circumstances that I think needs some detailed research and some work to understand how that could possibly take place.
Okay, so Matt, you suggested there should have been an exercise. As what Dany said, responded to that? Or
I
do you
agree
disagree?
with Danny's comments about that it can't be simply filling a building with people and evacuating it. I think you would need to scope out the expert advice from architects, from fire engineers, from expert toxicology, all the people who've given expert advice to the inquiry. I think would scope out the sorts of things you need to think about. And then I think you move on to a practical phase of, okay, let's design how you would do this. What would be the triggers for the decision making, for example, and then of course how could you do it? I think there's a point about the phrase, the word evacuation, because in reality I'm not sure we really are talking about evacuation in the middle of a fire. We're talking about a mass rescue operation, and I think the phrase evacuation can be misleading if we're not careful.
Sorry, Leanne.
I think Mark was going to come in next. So we were just talking about whether or not it would be possible, and I think we've started to explore that.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I completely endorse the approach that's being talked about that leads to evacuation, and I think it would be exercises. I think there would be a number that would have to take place. I also think the research needs to look at there are 3 different opportunities to move from stay put to a different means of leaving the building in the event of fire. And I think it links right back to the quality of the building from a fire safety perspective. Because if the building isn't right, and the responsible person knows the building isn't right, and will not be able to put it right, then they need to put in additional fire safety arrangements into that building to enable them to move away from stay put and evacuate people in the event they have a serious fire in that incident. I think the interim measure that we have in place at the moment, where we've got a number of buildings with ACM cladding on the side, other cladding in some circumstances, or no cladding at all but significant compartmentation or other fire safety issues, we've put interim arrangements in place to move from stay put to simultaneous evacuation, and the NFCC, London Fire Brigade and other colleagues have developed the guidance around waking watch, around temporary common fire alarms to enable that to happen. But that should only be for an interim period, and we're in a position now where in some circumstances we're into 2 years for that being in place and likely to be longer. And then I think the third element...
Do you consider 2 years to be an interim period?
No, I don't. I think there should have been, the ACM should have been off the buildings a long time ago. And then I think the third element is the really complicated piece about how you then make that decision in 3 o'clock in the morning in the middle of a very dynamic, complicated incident, the likes of which Matt and Dany have sort of set out to the committee.
I think Roy wanted to come in as well.
Just to add, I agree with everything that's been said so far. So we've also been trying to influence government too, and we've had some success. So a steering group is now being established to look at this research, move things forward, looking at literature review, social science, evacuation, interaction between operations, and it's got all those experts on the steering group that we recommend, including David Purser, one of the expert witnesses to the Grenfell Inquiry. So we will go through, because we need to remember this is a building strategy, not a fire and rescue service policy. So we need all those experts, those academics, those fire safety experts and building experts working with us to come from, if we know we might have to shift from stay put to emergency evacuation stroke rescue, it's the how that this group will now look into.
Fiona, did you want to come in as well?
I just wanted to add that I think when we were before the committee 3 weeks ago, we did stress the need for a national piece of research on this. I strongly believe this needs to be a national piece of research involving the Brigade, but involving a lot of other expertise from across the sector, and as people have mentioned, architects and such like, because I think that if we're going to do an exercise of nature, which I agree that we do, we need the people who need to be convinced that of the outcome of the exercise, that it is accurate. And I think we do need that little bit of we need independence from the London Fire Brigade in delivering this. They do need to be involved because obviously they understand best what happened on the night in terms of exactly what the conditions were like according to the research that Andy and his team have undertaken. But we do need it to have an element of independence so that it can give that assurance to everybody who needs to get that assurance about how that would actually work in practice, whether it's possible and how that would work. And as the Assistant Commissioner has indicated, this is something that's going to be looked into in much more depth in phase 2.
Can I just ask you though, and if you bring in any points that were sparked off by listening to others, even if we go through this process of reviewing and I think calling it fire rescue rather than evacuation is much more accurate. I have to agree with that. Even if we go through this process of doing a sort of national review that's independent, and I completely agree it should also be national, is that really going to go far enough unless we also bring in the aspects relating to build quality and looking at all of that area? And I can see, I just don't see how we can review high-rise rescues unless we're actually looking at the build quality and also the issue that I flagged up earlier, the one about the adjustments that people have made to buildings, because this building had been very seriously adjusted before the fire occurred.
No, absolutely, and I think that does come through in the recommendations and the findings of the report as well. However, what we've seen over the summer is a number of fires in buildings that also shouldn't have behaved in the way they did, and I think we have to make sure, and government has to make sure, building owners have to make sure, everybody in the whole sort of fire sector also needs to make sure that we get the fundamental change in the approach to fire safety in buildings. I think Matt used the word complacent earlier, and I think there has been a lot of complacency around fire safety in the built environment. However, we have to make sure that equally we are not complacent and that we don't just say, well, we've got to get the built environment right and then we don't have to change anything. We have to make sure that we get that plan B that there currently isn't for when fire safety features in buildings fail.
There's an argument that the fire service have been too good at making people feel that fires can be dealt with, leading to public complacency on this issue, or by building owners or managers. So I think that's a compliment in a very backhanded kind of way. But if we're looking at the, if we do agree that we do need to, because of this interim situation, which actually is now 2.5 years since Grenfell happened, if we're in that situation, does that mean that now, where we have agreed that because of the state of those buildings and because all of the ACM cladding has not been removed, that we do need to potentially adjust what we're doing around stay put? And I think we have agreed that's something that the fire service is looking at. Is that an area where more training is needed because of the issues around when do you make the decision to move from stay put over to a rescue situation? Is more training needed?
The interim arrangements that are currently in place with waking watches in place, actually that decision is almost taken out of the fire and rescue services hands, because as soon as a fire is discovered within that building, those waking watches should alert those people and evacuate that building. Hopefully by the time we get there, actually that will be well underway, if not completed. I can see Matt shaking his head, and we have similar concerns around actually if you have an interim measure in place for 2 to 2.5 years, whether those waking watches stay as effective as we hoped they would be, and whether they become complacent as well, which is why we're saying actually responsible people need to make sure that they don't see those as long-term arrangements, because that's not what they were envisaged as at all.
Did you want to come back in on that point?
A couple of points quickly. Firstly, on waking watches, we are extremely sceptical about the whole policy of waking watches. I have to say, to our colleagues in the NFCC, it was developed without our input, even though our members on the ground are presumably expected to operate within it. I think there's an obvious point that if you live in a cost-cutting world, you've got to raise a question of how will the waking watches actually be recruited and put into place? Who are they? What training have they had? What procedures are they following? Nobody seems to know any of this. And anecdotally, firefighters on the ground who've met people who are undertaking waking watch work are very sceptical about the ability to do anything in the event of a fire. So I think, and the final point to the NFCC is it's supposedly an interim policy. It's already 2.5 years. Phase 2, it's going to take another 2.5 years. Is this going to be an interim policy that's going to last 5 years? Because I don't think that's acceptable. And in terms of just developing another point about the relationship between operational response and the state of buildings, I think our concern is actually there's a danger of this not being joined up, because there should be. This is a whole system of the whole fire safety regime, which is what are buildings, what are the regulations by which they are built or altered, how do we inspect them, how do we enforce regulations. Our operational response fits into that wider picture, and yet we're looking at operational response when the other things haven't been put right at all.
So, I mean, I agree. It was called an interim measure because it was intended to be in place for a short period of time to prevent a situation where effectively we were prohibiting the use of many, many buildings across the country and moving people out of those buildings potentially into worse situations than they were previously in. And so I completely take that point. I do think that if we end up, the outcome of all of this research is we still end up in a position where all we'll have is slightly better trained firefighters and emergency services responders who need to go and knock on all the doors of a high-rise residential building that's on fire, involving them going above the fire itself to the rest of the building. I do think we'll have missed an opportunity, and there are a couple of things in particular around that. One is sprinklers. So we are responding to the consultation. We have a position statement about putting sprinklers in these buildings if they are over 11 metres in height, which would resolve this issue. The second is we've responded to a consultation recently and doing some work around a British standard about an evacuation system that is for the use of the fire service that is built into high-rise residential buildings. Scotland have been leading the way on this in particular, which would enable fire service, if you move from stay put to a simultaneous evacuation or rescue, you have a engineered facility to do that within the structure of the building.
Something to alert everybody in the building as well, that's hardwired in.
Yep, safer for the residents and safer for the firefighters operating it.
And we're completely with you in terms of sprinklers. We did a report after the Larkanal House fire from the Assembly, and we called for sprinklers after that. So, you know, we've been on very much on that page as well. There has, as well as sprinklers, there's been some discussion about smoke hoods. Do you think they would add something? Has there been any evaluation done of the impact of introducing them? Dany, I can see you.
So yes, clearly since we've introduced the London Fire Brigade, we have conducted a number of successful rescues of members of the public through smoke-filled environments to allow them to escape from those areas, and the smoke evacuation hoods have been very successful with those. So you know, we welcome the opportunity. We've got them on every frontline fire engine. Our firefighters all carry them on their breathing apparatus sets, and we've used them in a wide range of premises, not just high-rise, but in normal domestic premises to get people out of upper floors. So they have been very successful.
Oh, well, that's very, very encouraging. And my final question is to Roy, if you don't mind. I just wondered if we've had any response. I know the government has just sort of from tomorrow won't exist as the government, but I just wondered if they'd responded to the NFCC call to instigate a research programme to consider and develop procedures to support an emergency mass rescue in a high-rise building, which would... Obviously, we wouldn't want to see firefighters being put at risk at that point either, or any member of the public.
And yes, they have, which is the steering group I referred to earlier, which has
so
now
been their response to set up the steering
CLG. And I think the point that people have been making about the whole system is, you know, is the designers, the planners, the architects, the builders, the subcontractors, the building owners, all those people. The system needs to be fixed. Competence needs to be there across the board, and includes us in that system, but it's the whole system that needs fixing.
Well, I personally would quite like to see something introduced in Parliament immediately that says that any suggestions from the Fire Brigade around fire safety that are given to architects or surveyors when they're designing a building in the first place or planning any changes must be implemented without quibble. But at the moment, as we've already said, that's not the case. Thank you, Chair.
Before we move on this, I want to come to Matt. Because you produced a very interesting paper, 3-page paper on the 30th of October. And you make two particular points which I think are important. First of all, you make the point that the inquiry in producing phase 1 didn't take any evidence or advice from Steve McGirt, the former chief officer, who was appointed by the inquiry to advise on firefighting matters. And I do find that a bit surprising. And he certainly doesn't appear in the I don't know if it's right or not, but it doesn't appear in the report itself about the people who were consulted. So it'd be useful to know whether that is in fact the case. And the other point you make is about the practicalities of a rescue. What the report says is that there was a window between 1:30 a.m. and 1:50 a.m. where a rescue or mass evacuation or a mass rescue could have taken place. And you make the point that at that time there were only 30 firefighters on the fire ground. Obviously, the makeup was rapidly increasing, but there's no FRU, which meant that there was no extended duration breathing apparatus. And we know from the rest of the report that the crews who were equipped with standard breathing apparatus couldn't reach the 24th floor before their air was going to run out. So you also make the point there was no senior officers, and presumably all those 30 firefighters who were there at that time wouldn't all have been available to effect mass rescue anyway, because they'd have other duties like laying out hose and connecting up and the hose to the hydrants and operating the pumps and so forth, and operating the BA boards. So perhaps you could just comment on that, because I think that's quite an interesting and trenchant criticism of the report, which is very much focused on that. Of course, if people were making calls to the control under 999, they could have, I suppose, been advised then to get out, and we'll come to control shortly. But I just wondered what you thought about those points that you made there, and if you'd expand on them.
I think it is probably our biggest area of concern with the report in terms of, and it's not about the recommendations, it's about the narrative within the report. The 30 firefighters of watch manager and below in attendance, presumably nobody would expect them to completely stop firefighting, so somebody has to operate pumps, somebody has to lay out hose, someone has to point the hose at the building, people have to fight fires, and to the simply, I think for anyone who's worked in the fire service, the idea that 20-something firefighters drop everything else they're doing, let the fire burn, and go into a building in that and evacuate some approaching 200 people. I think we all struggle with how that is feasible. In terms of how, and then the question is for us, what is the evidential basis on which that analysis was made within the report? Because, as you say, the report says between 130 and 150. Barbara Lane's report says the window is between, if I'm correct, 126 and 140. So it's a 14 minutes. So the 14 minutes is extended to 20 minutes, but it's a different 20 minutes to that identified by Barbara Lane, who is the expert witness on that matter. And very significantly, because this is clearly a firefighting matter, the expert witness, who, by the way, is not a particular friend of ours, we objected to his appointment, but he is the expert witness for the inquiry, Steve McGurk, and we actually wrote to the inquiry during the process saying, you've appointed a firefighting expert witness, you must ask that firefighting expert witness his view of whether an evacuation was feasible. They did not do so, and Mr McGurk, I think, deferred to others on that point. So you've got, I'd say it's baffling as to why you have a firefighting expert witness who is not asked a question on a key firefighting matter that then leads, I mean, that is actually, if you look at the public debate, that's probably the major debate in the public, and the firefighting expert witness has given no evidence on that matter and has not indeed been asked on that matter by the inquiry. So that is a major concern for us.
Dany, sorry. Hang on. Sorry, could you please sit down? Please sit down. No, you can't say it at the moment. Please sit down, or we'll have to adjourn. Please sit down, or we'll have to adjourn the hearing. Could you please sit down, or we'll have to adjourn the hearing. Right.
GLA Chamber Sound. GLA Chamber Sound. GLA Chamber Sound. GLA Chamber Sound.
Back in session. Dany, did you want to comment on what Matt had to say?
We have some serious concerns around and I think Sir Martin Morbick himself said that some of his assertions around his comments around evacuation were not based with any expert testimony or evidence to do that, which is why that we think these matters should be explored in phase 2 when we have got a wide range of expert evidence that talks around the conditions inside the tower. But I do share Matt's concerns that it would be very difficult for a small number of firefighters to make their way into the tower in those circumstances to do that evacuation, which is why we urgently need this piece of work to be done to support that, because this is about the work of the firefighters and the job they can do and what they might face day in, day out today if they go attend another one of these buildings.
Sorry, Andy may correct me on this. Just in terms of what the gentleman said, in terms of the Purser evidence, there is a key element at the end of his comment. I disagree with the time in his advice anyway, but it is subject to the existence of a fire alarm, a fire evacuation system within the building, which of course did not exist. His comment about evacuation relies on the existence of a fire alarm system which wasn't in place at Grenfell Tower.
That caveat's correct.
Andy?
Yeah, that caveat's absolutely correct, and Matt's right. The FBU are core participants, as London Fire Brigade are. We're not aware that Steve McGurk has provided any evidence. We would certainly expect if he has, we would have seen that. The only input I believe he's had is into the recommendations. All of the expert witnesses were asked to provide suggested recommendations. We've seen that from Steve McGurk, but quite clearly in that he talks about actually it's a very complex incident, and he made some recommendations, but he quite clearly points to actually there needed to be a lot more evidence and exploration of the evidence within phase 2.
I'm sorry, Andrew, but even if there had been an alarm system, is it actually humanly possible to have evacuated Grenfell Tower in 7 to 8 minutes, which was the point that was just being made? With 200 residents, I'm somewhat dubious that you could get 200 people out of a building of that size with 24 floors in 7 to 8 minutes. Roy?
I think David Purser does caveat much more than just the fire alarm. My paraphrasing what he says is that was an ideal situation with an ideal notice, and hopefully to let people look forward. David Purser is an invited member of the steering group to look at evacuation, so he have every opportunity to put those points of view to all the other experts, and we can come up with a proper conclusion amongst ourselves.
So that question is definitely going to be answered by that expert group.
Well, it will be set to the expert group. Hopefully we'll come up with some answers from that group, yes.
Okay, we're going to move on to control now. No, sorry, Susan.
I'll be quick. Can perhaps, Commissioner, can you say why was the staple policy not thoroughly re-evaluated after Lacknor, where compartmentalisation failed?
So obviously, as been expressed by my colleague, Staper is a building safety strategy policy. It's not a London Fire Brigade policy or fire service policy. It is the policy that is based on buildings behaving in the correct manner that allow firefighters to enter that building and put the fire out. So the stay put is not a fire service policy to review as such. What we have done is provide the additional training and information to our firefighters and officers of signs to look for and what to do should a building behave in an abnormal way and fire be spread in a way that shouldn't be allowed to happen if the building is built correctly.
In your opinion, do you not think that the London Fire Brigade has been slightly naive, assuming that all buildings will react as they're supposed to react?
I don't think that we assume that, because we see day-to-day evidence where minor issues occur and where fire spreads in different ways. What we have never seen, and no fire service has ever seen, is a comprehensive building failure that happened in Grenfell Tower.
But you do see building failures all the time then?
So we see issues. Obviously our fire safety inspection officers, when they're inspecting buildings, will come across contraventions and fire safety issues, which is when we issue our notice of deficiency or our prohibition orders on those buildings. But we've never seen such a set of circumstances before.
Okay, just to, because it's concerning me why it takes so long to get our senior officers in. When the senior officers are called in, are they blue lighted in? Do they?
Absolutely, yes. They drive, so they're all trained to do emergency response driving, and they drive in cars from the address they're at.
And it still took an hour and a half to get in?
That was the Assistant Commissioner. Obviously our station manager and group managers were on the fire ground considerably quicker than that. That was just the one Assistant Commissioner time that Andy gave you. I think we've got a full list of the times of the arrival of all the other officers.
They're in the report.
I'll go through the report and look. Thank you.
Nothing on control.
I want to explore a couple of questions on the control room. The report clearly notes that the control room was completely overwhelmed given the sort of volume of 99 calls that it received. And then it goes on to state that in many cases, control room operators failed to handle FSG calls in an appropriate and effective manner. This is followed by 4 recommendations. So the opening question is, what contingency plans are in place to deal with large number of emergency calls?
So, that's the work that we were discussing earlier that we've been doing, where we've been looking at different methods of handling fire survivor guidance calls. We're reviewing our current policy. Part of that is work we need to do nationally, because where one control room is overwhelmed with the volume of fire survivor guidance calls, then we have additional control rooms that take those calls, and it's about how we share that information. Obviously in London Fire Brigade we have more control officers on duty than any other control room around the country, so this is a piece of work that the National Fire Chiefs Council are doing about how we deal with the overflow volume of fire survivor guidance calls. Obviously the way we deal with fire survivor guidance calls at the moment, and the policy states that, you know, our control operators will remain on the call if someone is unable to leave their premises to provide support and advice and reassurance. We're now reviewing that, because it may well obviously be the case that our control operators can't dedicate themselves to one call, and that's a review. But, you know, for us it is about understanding about how we answer those calls, but more importantly how we record that information and share that information with the fire ground, and that is the work we're doing with the ongoing testing and exercising at the moment.
The report, the recommendations cover both the review that you mentioned and also training for the operators, which are so critical, because every second, every minute lost in actually identifying and scrutinizing the nature of the call and the trigger in terms of action that follows. So this is most critical sort of point in time when you know, everything flows from there. Do you have a time frame as to how quickly can you undertake this review as well as conclude the training, so that you have the control room fit for purpose in that respect?
So the control officers have all undertaken the training now. That's been ongoing over the last 2 years, so they have all received the additional training around fire survivor guidance. What we're talking about is new and enhanced policies to help support development of new technologies about sharing information. So the training is all in place now. The control officers not only have received training themselves, but training on working with operational crews and with command unit crews on sharing that information.
You get, again, looking at the information from report, you got, in a sense, two kind of calls that you get. Some are advisory, you know, coming through the control room, and some are emergencies. How are you able to differentiate those, and can that be done in a way so that true emergency calls are not held up and therefore time taken to address those calls?
So in a normal event on any day in our control room, the control receive a wide range of calls, from the basic information calls, some inappropriate calls where people are calling for matters that don't concern the fire service, right across to people concerns about fire safety issues, to minor level emergencies, for instance a waste bin light someone referred to earlier, up to large scale incidents. Not only that, they are dealing with calls in from other control rooms, from other blue light services, and sharing information. So we have protocols in place, but we have a time taken to answer our emergency service calls, and then if it's not somebody where the control operator needs to stay on the line, they deal with that, then ensure the right resources dispatch, and then they terminate that call and go on to answer the next call. Unfortunately, if you have a queue of calls coming in, there's no way of identifying what the nature of those calls are, but where one of the things is about understanding where there are operational incidents, where we were talking about earlier about the 99I information sharing, so we can understand what a member of the public is saying. Because if you phone up as a member of the public, something is immediately very urgent to you, but might be a low-level fire, but you might describe it as a major incident. And it's about getting the wider range of situational awareness and understanding. But understanding as well, on that night, our control operators dealt with more fire survivor guidance calls that night than they had done the previous 10 years combined. And at one point, you know, they dealt with over 408 priority operational telephone calls. So the number of those calls, the volume of those calls, the information they were trying to process, the information they were trying to share with other control rooms and other blue light services and with the fire ground was simply overwhelming for the volume of staff who were there.
So can you absolutely reassure us that based on the recommendations that have been made in the report, you are on top of the job in terms of making sure that you do have both the policy review as well as the aspects of identifying calls as your top priority?
Yes, so obviously we're working on that. We've one of the other things we've done is we've introduced a new assistant commissioner whose dedicated role is that of working in control, and he's produced a control improvement plan, which he's undergone a number of steps to look at and review policies and procedures in control, and that's his sole job and responsibility to implement that plan. Obviously, we welcome the work we need to do with our colleagues in the National Fire Chiefs Council about the wider sharing of information between control rooms and how we relay information not only between fire control rooms but other blue light control rooms as well.
Could I add that I think that it would be really worthwhile the committee and other interested Assembly members meeting the new Assistant Commissioner who's overseeing this work at Control. And I think last time we came to the committee we mentioned the possibility of members going both to Merton, where I know you've visited before, but also to the Stratford facility, just so that you understand what has been done, what is in train, and get that assurance that actually we're not just sitting here telling you that things are being done, but actually you can hear for yourself, you can talk to the people who are actually implementing this, so that you can have that confidence that what we're doing is actually sort of what we're saying we're doing.
Matt, do you want to come in on anything that you heard? Or any
I suppose I'll just pick up on the points that came up in earlier in the discussion, is that I think the question of controls, I mean, there have been cuts in job numbers in the London Fire Control over the past decade. And I reported earlier before you arrived that actually we have fire controls in the UK which on some occasions go down to a staffing level of 1, and how you can handle any single fire survival guidance call in those situations is beyond us. And I think in terms of a review, one thing that I think is often missed, and it's why systems end up failing, is the end user involvement. Actually, what people fail to talk to is actually the control staff on the front line dealing with this. And it's all very well the NFCC saying they're going to review all these things. What they often fail to talk to is the people actually who take those calls and do the job on the front line.
Thank you, Chair.
Yeah, a couple of more detailed points, if I may, and maybe for Andy or Dany. One of the things that comes out of the report is when the decision was made to revoke stay put, virtually simultaneously by Andy on the fire ground and by the control supervisor. How the transition from stay put to get out was somewhat haphazard, to say the least. Some of the control operators were giving very clear, very blunt guidance, as they're supposed to do: get out or you'll die. And others were saying, well, you know, people were arguing with them and say, okay, well, stay put. And the way that the change was communicated to control was by passing around a piece of paper with saying change to get out rather from stay put, which all seems a bit haphazard. But what's been done to try and make sure that that transition from stay put to get out is conveyed effectively to callers?
I think in the circumstances we saw that night, I think the holding up of a piece of paper and walking around the control room with it was just a pragmatic solution, because everybody was engaged in a call. I think there was no other way to deal with that at the time. I think in terms of how that was handled, and you talked about some control officers provided really blunt advice, and some of it was less blunt than that. I think the training that's been done by the control staff over the past 2 years has reinforced that message, that actually if there is a change to get out, you need to be much more blunt about that, and you need to leave virtually no option for the caller on the other end, particularly when you get to a point where actually staying is no longer an option. So I think that's been reinforced over the past 2 years. In terms of how we communicate that change and that stay put, certainly in Merton with the introduction of the new wall screen, that can be displayed on that now, and similar but smaller screens at Stratford. I think that's the way we would do it in the future. But I think certainly on that night, as you say, it seems a slightly simple way to do it, but I think that was a pragmatic solution on the night.
Okay, and you've mentioned the introduction of the new Assistant Commissioner in charge of control, and presumably there's been a restructuring sort of down the command structure in control following from that. Can you give us an update on the development of the Brigade's control improvement plan?
Yeah, so obviously the new Assistant Commissioner has been in post for a little while now. He's undertaken the work closely involving all of the control staff in the control room, because as Matt quite rightly says, it's very important that the people who are doing the job, the people who are doing it day in, day out, are absolutely involved in any changes that need to be introduced. So the plan was only presented to my board very recently, and as a result of that, a board is being set up to implement all of those changes. What we are doing is ensuring where we have things like the training review and the control review, all of those are being overseen because obviously each one of those impacts on not only the recommendations here but the learning that we've developed ourselves. So it's about ensuring that we have oversight across all of those pieces of work to understand not only that they are taking place, that they are progressing as we've wished, but the interaction between all those pieces of work is recognised. And now, obviously, what we are currently doing is a piece of detailed work, look into the 1,000+ pages of this report to ensure that we look through not only the key recommendations at the end, but all of the narrative throughout to pick up any other areas and ensure that's encompassed into the operational learning we're doing now.
Okay, could I come to Roy? I'll come to Matt in a minute. Come to Roy and Mark. One of the issues that arose was the transfer of information between different controls when the 999 calls started to be diverted to other controls around the country. What progress has been made in addressing the challenges of that sharing of information between the controls to which they were transferred and the main control operating out of London, and obviously vice versa if there's an incident elsewhere?
Well, I think there's two aspects to this. One is the policy and the people and the training. That's the human side. And just to reassure Matt, that's been led by the mobilising officers group, which are virtually all control officers with some other input. So that is one side. The other side is the technological solutions. And there's something called MAID, which is the automatic transfer of information between controls, which we have asked government to invest in over a number of years now. But the use of data and technology rather than relying on humans to pick up a phone and talk to each other is important, not only between fire controls but between ambulance and police and fire control. So that's the big push, and that technology is available. We just need the investment to make sure it works.
Yeah, I mean, for example, the report makes the point that ambulance and police can share their CAD calls, but the brigade can't.
And that's the thing. So the mate system will be able to do that between the three controls anywhere in the country.
What's the timescale for that?
We need the investment in the money. So as soon as the money comes in and is invested, we can push forward on that.
And is that money from government?
Well, the government or fire authorities, the money will need to come from somewhere.
Okay, Matt, you wanted to...
I just wanted to picking up on the point about, and there's a recommendation on the management of the shift from stay put to evacuate, and that's the point you picked up on. I don't think you can separate that from the earlier discussion about what is the national guidance on stay put versus evacuation and the need for research and planning around that. I suppose, for me, we have to plan for these eventualities, including planning for when things go wrong, because you then train for what you planned for. I think the difficulty on the night of Grenfell is because it had not been planned for, people were not trained for, and therefore people were expected, or actually largely in hindsight, are expected to make decisions for an event that hadn't been planned or prepared for.
So, Mark, you want to...
The fire survival guidance and the stay put and the shift to evacuation, I also think we shouldn't lose sight of the responsibility of the responsible person for the building to make sure that they're communicating really clearly to the residents of those buildings what the circumstances are for the building that they live in, and in addition to that, being aware of who in particular are the vulnerable people that live in your building, and then to have personal emergency evacuation plans in place for those individuals, and then that supports the fire service when we get involved in dealing with an incident in that building.
Okay, and Andy, one of the criticisms was the lack of training on FSG calls or refresher training on FSG calls. What was the reason for that? Was it because of the extra training you need to do on the vision system?
But we believe that has an impact. So after the Lacanau inquest, we implemented that training and we expected that to take place on an annual basis. It does for 2 or 3 years, and then it falls away, and it's not completed by all members of the control staff. That coincides with the implementation of vision, and we know that the control operators were doing a lot of work and training to address those implementation issues with vision, training on various patches and workarounds. So our working assumption at the moment is that those implementation visions with issue may well have impacted on the delivery of other training such as FSG refresher training.
Okay, thank you. And picking up Fiona's invitation, I'm sure we'll like to go visit control before too long. I think that is the end of the questions that we want to raise. Does anybody want to add anything to what you've said today? Right, start with Andy and work round.
From me.
Fiona?
No, I think it's just to reiterate that this is a personal commitment from the Mayor to make sure that he does everything in his power to ensure that the recommendations are implemented, both as they relate to the fire brigade and to other people the recommendations are aimed at. And it would be good to meet at a very early opportunity to talk about what format you would find that public reporting helpful to be in.
Okay, Roy?
Thank you.
Mark? Matt?
Thanks.
Well, can I thank you all for your contributions? I think it's been a very useful session. And obviously, this is only going to be the start of our work scrutinising the Brigade's response to Grenfell. I think we're going to be returning next in some detail to the training issue as being part of a more in-depth review of the recommendations and what the Brigade's been doing. And I think also we'll be keeping a very close eye on the development of the next London Safety Plan, which presumably is underway at the moment, and hopefully will be reflecting some of the lessons from Grenfell. So can I thank you all for coming, and can we note the report and today's discussion and agree to delegate authority to the Chair in consultation with party group lead members to agree any output from the meeting.
Agreed.
Thank you. The meeting is closed. Thank you.
GLA Chamber.